Bhasker is a multi-award-winning BBC News cameraman. This is his 3-hour account of a 40-year career covering major crises and the world's trouble spots, as well as royal and political stories. He talks of wars, famines, disasters and civil unrest, and is honest about how the things he's seen have affected his mental state. He starts by telling me about family life in Kenya and his early fascination with photography.
1921, my grandfather, at the age of 21, was living in a village in India, in Gujarat. For some reason, he made a decision that he's going to make a move, and he left his wife and young daughter in the village with his mother, and he travelled for about 2 to 3 weeks by ship into East Africa. By that time, in 1921, the railway track was already in place in Kenya. He went from Mombasa to a place called Nakuru and started a business. So he started this business. 2-3 years later, calls his wife and daughter over, then has more kids. At the age of 37, after having 6 daughters and 2 sons, he decides that he wants to take his family on holiday to India. They were getting ready for that. He suddenly has a massive heart attack and dies. So my father and some of the siblings had to go back to India because the breadwinner had gone. And they went through a lot of poverty because there was no income. My father was 3 years old when my grandfather died. He went to India and had a bit of education in the village, primary school. He then, at the age of about 14, one of his sisters, who was already married when my grandfather died, pulled him over back to Kenya because he was born in Kenya and he had the papers to come back in. He came back. The idea was to get more education, but 2 weeks into his trip, he had an accident with a bicycle, not a motorcycle, but just a bicycle, and broke his leg. So his education went out the window. He then subsequently studied there, started working in the newspaper business, compositing, which is sort of making up the page before the page is printed. And that's how he learned his English as well. Then later went back to India, got married, came back, and I was born in Kenya. But in 1972, my father decided to move here with a British passport after Kenya became independent in 1964. So we moved to the UK in 1972. But although he had a British passport, he had to get a visa to come here. My name was on my mother's passport, and she had some sort of exempted visa. So we came in August, just before the start of the school year, August 72, we came here. My father had to wait another 6 months before he could get a visa and come across. While he was waiting there, he put a wager on something, and he won some money. And with that money, he decided to buy a camera. So fast forward 1976, the camera was used for a bit at home, but there was something wrong with it. So my father had sent it off to London to a relative who was in the photographic industry to get it repaired in London. And I did my CSEs in 1976. In the summer holidays, I went to London to pick up the camera, and the relative sort of showed me the basics before I went to central London to the holiday sort of tourist spots and took some photos. Came back home, got the film processed, and the photos were okay.
This was a stills camera?
This is a stills camera,
right, okay.
Old film, 35mm film.
Yeah.
Pentax SP2.
Right.
With a 50mm Tokuma lens. My father had made a good investment in that. And just out of sheer luck, and this is where I say that somebody up there has been looking after me all my life. A few days later, my father's friend comes to our house and sort of his brother has recently moved to Leicester. Their daughter was getting married, but they couldn't afford a professional photographer. Is there anybody you can suggest who can take photos of the wedding? My dad said, well, he's just taken these photos, they're okay, take him. So within 2 weeks of picking up a camera, I was doing a wedding. And those photos came out all right. So that's where the bug really started. I was really into photography.
So what age were you then?
This was 16. So the bug was really there in terms of working into photography, completely mad about photography. I then went to Gateway Sixth Form College, which was where I was going to do my A-levels. But at the same time, as luck would have it, there was an engineering teacher who normally taught engineering. But on Wednesday afternoons, he taught photography because that was his hobby. And he was quite prominent in sort of changing my sort of thinking of photography as well, John Knoll. That teacher ran evening classes as well. So I went to do evening classes. So while I was doing my A-levels, I was really going into photography. I'm just completely mad about it. And I started doing wedding photos as well in the Asian community. Financially, it wasn't lucrative, but it was a great training ground to discipline in terms of dealing with different people, covering events, and that's live events and that sort of thing. So combination of that and my father's history of working in the newspaper industry. So the back of my mind, the newspaper industry was still the carrot I was interested in terms of photography, news photography.
But you were also learning logistics, weren't you? You learned how to plan, where to be for the different bits of a wedding.
Exactly, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But also, going back to Nairobi again, when I was a kid, my mum had 5 sons, so all younger than me. My dad was working in the newspaper industry. He was at work all day. Mm-hmm. So my mum couldn't leave the kids and go shopping. So from a very early age, I used to go shopping for my mum. And so I became streetwise, which involved literally going shopping for things like meat, chicken, that sort of thing. So I used to go to the butchers in Nairobi. In those days, the delicacy was goat's brains. So I would go to the butchers and ask for goat's brains, and they said, I haven't got anything here. Go and talk to Mwangi in the back, and he'll sort something out for you. So I would go to the back, and the guy would go into the fridge, get half a dozen skulls out, chop them in half in front. So I would sit opposite him, or put it on a lump of wood, chop it in half, get the brains out, and that's what I would take home. But I wasn't squeamish about that. That was just normal life. On Sunday mornings, here you have a Sunday roast. In Kenya, we used to have Sunday chicken. So I would go to the chicken market, which is about 2 to 3 kilometers walk, with my cousin, and we would go to the market and they'd sort of point out, and there were live chickens sitting in cages. So he would sort of point one chicken out, and he'd say, right, okay, £2.25. No, I want something smaller. So he'd throw that back in, get another one out, £2, and it's okay, I'll take that. They would send that into the next room where the chicken sort of chopped off, cleaned it, all that sort of thing. So we would go in there and see what bits and pieces we could buy from that as well. So I wasn't squeamish, and I learned all that, sort of seeing all this sort of destruction, so to speak, in the butchers, and used to bring that home. Little did I know that subsequently, later on in life, it was quite helpful psychologically. Going back to the weddings, then sort of taking the wedding photographs and that sort of thing, that was going on. A-levels were going on. And had a careers meeting at the college I was at. And one of the teachers suggested that there are 2 options. One, do a photographic degree. But the problem with that is that you apply for the course, you got to get a 2 or 3 year degree. You become a professional photographer, but you've got to work with a professional for another 10 years before you make a name for yourself. So it's quite a hard career path to become a sort of known name in terms of photography. The other option in the photography industry was sort of the BBC trains people. So I started looking into that. 76, I think it was the Queen's, one of the Queen's Jubilees. I bumped into a camera crew somewhere and started talking to them, asked them for advice and that sort of thing. One of them suggested that if you keep on writing to the BBC, they open a file on you. So I took that on board, and still to this day, I don't know whether it's true or not. But I kept on writing any excuse. It's sort of, I'm now 18, I've done this, I've done this photography thing, this. Then one of the teachers sort of saw an ad in the paper for a trainee cameraman. So I applied for that and kept on sort of sending information they wanted. And about 2.5 years later, I had finished my A-levels. We've been on an expedition to Jamaica with a bunch of other students for 5 weeks. We arrived back at Heathrow Airport. These are the days when there were no mobile phones. You had to phone from a phone box. So I had no communications with my family for 5 weeks while I was in Jamaica on this expedition. I landed at Heathrow Airport, came out from customs. I went into a phone box, and there were 31 other people waiting outside. Called home, and instead of any information from the BBC, and they said, yes, you've got a contract. I had the interviews in Birmingham before I left. Came out and I said, I've got it, and 31 people outside went, whoa! And that's how the BBC sort of life really started.
Great. So you presumably went to Wood Norton?
Went to Wood Norton for 3 months. Used to go by train, and my parents used to drop me off at the railway station, and this is the real old days, to go to Wood Norton, a week there, 3 months of classroom training, A Course 68, and that was the best training because it was all classroom training in terms of engineering in case something goes down. And you had to have an exam every Friday afternoon. And you had to pass the exam in order to carry on into the next week. And they were quite strict about it. Sort of there were people who, if they didn't sort of pass the exams, they were sort of thrown out. Finished the 3 months. This was September, October, around November, end of November, beginning of December. I was transferred to BBC Pebble Mill. And arrived at the Pebble Mill building, and I was picked up at the reception from another cameraman to show me around. So he showed me around the building. Then he said, well, there's a lot of people on strike, so we can't do any programs at the moment, so you can go home now. So
easy first day.
Easy first day. So I went home, and he said a couple of days later, came back again, same thing. They were still on strike. I came back a few days later, went into a 2-day drama. And the first job as a trainee cameraman, in those days the studio cameras were connected to the walls in order to get the data back into the 2-inch tape machines, was through a 1-inch thick cable. But when that cameras moved, that cable made a lot of noise because it was lying on the floor. Yes. So as a trainee cameraman, the first thing you do is, first job was cable bashing.
Yeah.
And that was great because on things like Pebble Mill 1, which was a live program, and you got cameras moving all over the place, cable bashing was great fun. I used to do things like that, Saturday night at the mill, and then you slowly progress in doing sort of a bit of camera, a bit of camera, a bit of camera. So I worked at Pebble Mill for about 4 years, but at the back of the mind there was still an interest in news.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
When you were at Pebble Mill, did you ever get to operate cameras?
Yes.
You did?
Yes. So
on air?
On air.
Yes.
So slowly, sort of, the initial thing was cable bashing,
right,
in the initial few weeks. But then you progress in terms of sort of do the graphics camera, or do the camera with the least amount of shots on a drama. But the other thing was, because you're working with a camera crew, which are 5-man team, plus the assistant. So you've got people on 5 cameras plus the 1 or 2 assistants, or trainees, sorry, I should say. You are involved in their conversations in terms of the shots. And I remember sitting with one coffee break, and we talked about one shot for at least half an hour. Really? For a single shot. And those are the conversations which sort of really think about what's happening, because the experienced guys know sort of how to... there's a guy called John Cousins who was really good on a pedestal, on a camera, on a live shot. He can do a lot of moves, but he can talk about it afterwards as well. So that was sort of all...
Big, long, complex, developing shot.
Sort of start off on a sort of, I don't know, wide and go in all the way around the all around the stage, and that sort of thing. The other thing with Pebble Mill was sort of the Pebble Mill 1 program quite often got the music acts coming in at 11 o'clock, and you're on air at 1 o'clock. By the time they've set up, they haven't got time to rehearse. So you had to improvise in terms of what shots you offer and what shots you do and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they always used to have one camera on the back end balcony on the higher platform, so compared to the floor itself.
Safety shot.
Safety shot.
Yeah.
So start off doing that on the live program,
right,
and that's you're live on air.
Very exciting, though.
Very exciting in those days. Then used to do Saturday night at the mill, similar thing, late at night. And one of the things that sort of happened was, in those days, when I was a kid, I used to watch a television series called Kojak with Telly Savalas.
Yes.
On the Pebble Mill program, one day, sort of Telly Savalas was coming in. This is quite early on. And I came into the building especially to see him. And I was standing there, I saw him, and I thought, I'm going to see this for the rest of my life now. So that's when all the glamour of celebrities went away. I meet people, and I'm more interested in what the person is rather than how famous they are.
Sure, yes. Yes.
So I did the Pebble Mill. And then into the third year, around 82, they were going to refurbish the main studio, A, in Birmingham. By that time, I was already doing sport in terms of golf, football, snooker. Did a lot of snooker at the Crucible. Steve Davis winning the World Cup or the World Championships. We did a cycling championship as well in Leicester. But the fun was, for me as a young person, fun was going up into a cherry picker 50 feet up in the air, covering the golf when the ball sort of takes off, so you can see it, follow it.
Now, tell me, if you're following a ball like that, doesn't matter what sport it is, how do you do that? Do you always use the camera image, or do you look outside the camera?
No, it's always the camera image, because it's got to be in your viewfinder.
Yes, of course.
Otherwise, you can't see it.
No, quite.
Especially the golf ball. But they were trying out a slightly different coloured ball. The way the cameras worked was you see 3 colours coming in. And on the viewfinder, you could specify which colour to pick in order to see what specific tube. You could do that. So the viewfinders were advanced. So if there was a slightly orangey ball, if you look at the red tube, it stands out.
Yeah.
And the viewfinder, so you can see it. So that was sort of quite one of the tricks of the trade, so to speak, in terms of sort of following a ball. Sort of, especially if you're higher up, it's not easy to follow a ball all the way through. But it's sort of, you've got to have the same track, so where the ball's going to go, because you see it taking off, and you've got to make sure it's sort of followed all the way through. Otherwise, it looks a bit.
Yes, I mean the camera move itself has to be good.
Yeah,
you have to keep the thing in.
And you've got to be safe in terms of you're sort of 50 feet, 100 feet up in the air. And follow it that way.
On your cherry picker.
One other thing is the cameras in those days were quite large. So it took...
We're talking about studio cameras.
Studio cameras,
yes.
Going back to the studio... And they're staying with the studio cameras. The main studio cameras, the ME 2001, it took 4 people to lift a camera. So if on Pebble Mill, if one of the cameras went down just before we went live on air, or there was something wrong with it which they didn't have time to play with in the lineup, 4 of you had to run to Studio B, up the stairs, take the camera off another pedestal, bring it all the way down, plug it up, and make sure the system works. But it had to be done by 4 people because the camera was so big.
Yes.
Subsequently, slowly, the Ikegami HL79 came out, which was a single shoulder-mounted camera, and you could take the camera outside. It all had to be cabled, and all the controls on the camera goes back to the control room where there's an engineer sitting, controlling the colours, the exposure, and all that sort of thing.
The racks are yes. Yeah, absolutely. But nonetheless, you were able to do some handheld
work. That's right. But that was a sort of big thing, a big move in terms of sort of where everything else was on a pedestal beforehand.
But crucial when you think of your subsequent career.
Exactly.
Yeah. So your interest in news, I mean, was this a genuine interest in news itself, or was it just an interest in being able to get out on the road?
No, it was genuine interest in news.
Yes.
Back in the mind, there was genuine interest in news. And one of the stories that stands out is sort of when I was a kid in Nairobi, my dad came back home one evening and said there's been a coup in Uganda and a guy called Idi Amin's taken over. This is around 1970-ish. So I was about 10 years old. So this was sort of information which sort of, because Dad was into news, sort of we're picking up little bits of information which was sort of, and I was always interested in other people's stories anyway, ever since I was a child. While I was at Pebble Mill, there was talk of sort of refurbishing Studio A. And so they suggested you can go to any other BBC department for 3 months while the studio has been refurbished, because there's not going to be any work at Pebble Mill for everybody. I was interested in news, sort of I wanted to make inquiries about how to get into news, but nobody knew how to get into news. So one of my colleagues, he went to the film unit in Birmingham, and I asked him, sort of, how did he get in? And he said, just went to the boss and asked him. So I found, in those days, the BBC used to have a directory with phone numbers. So I found somebody senior in BBC News, phoned him up, and I said, I want to come and have a look at cameras in news. And the gentleman answered the phone and said, you don't want me, you want Ken Oxley. I phoned Ken Oxley up and said, sort of, I'm interested in coming down to have a look at news cameras, expecting him to say, let me think about it. But he said, yeah, when? So I was sort of taken aback because I hadn't planned my next answer. So I then I said, let me sort myself out and I'll come back to you. And I went across to news for a 3-4 day trial, just to follow somebody, look around. In a studio environment, if you're working, it's quite restrictive in terms of you've got to be completely quiet. While you are waiting for when the other cameras are working, because there are usually 5 cameras in a studio. Not all of them are working at the same time. Some are just waiting for the next scene and that sort of thing. And you have to be absolutely quiet. You can't have a conversation and that sort of thing. You can't go away because you don't know when you're going to be needed and that sort of thing. So that was quite restrictive. On the news business, you are out on the road. You can communicate with people, seeing different things. So I found that fascinating. So I applied for an official attachment and got a 2-month attachment in news. While I was on attachment, they asked me...
This was in London?
This is in London. Yeah, so I moved out of Pembrokeshire into London. I come to London for a 2-month attachment, which turned into 3 months, which turned into 4 months. In between, one of the big events was the Maze prison escape happened. But in order to move to London as into news, although I was a trained cameraman in terms of studios and all framing and all that sort of thing, I didn't have the skills to go on the road. So I had to spend time with somebody. In those days, the technology was that you have a shoulder-mounted camera or a tripod-mounted single Ikigami HL79 camera, but there was an umbilical cord onto a tape recorder, BBU 50, to record 20 minutes of video. So I had to join as a recordist, so whereby you record the video and the audio onto that. So one of the things they asked me to do was, I got a phone call about 8 o'clock in the evening. 6 o'clock in the evening, the flight was probably about 8, 9 o'clock. There was an escape at the Maze prison in Belfast. Can you go there now? So I went to the television centre, picked up some equipment, went to Heathrow Airport. We had to book a spare seat for the Ikigami camera to get onto the plane. And we went to Belfast, and we were driving through the Maze area, and there were sort of soldiers jumping out because this is the middle of the night. In the morning, we went to some shops where over 19th century devices had gone off. And we parked the car and walking towards the shops, and people who I'd never seen before was saying, morning, morning, morning. And this was sort of a strange phenomenon for me, because it's sort of completely different environment. I've never seen these people. And I'm of a Hindu Asian background. I knew there were issues about Catholics and Protestants, but I didn't fully understand. So in order to understand,
you were all right. You weren't.
No, exactly. But also, I would go to people and ask them, "Are you Catholic? Are you Protestant?"
Yes.
And I didn't get a punch in the face because they knew I was a complete outsider. And it was fascinating because I learned quite a lot in terms of sort of then subsequently, the more trips I did, the more sort of I learned the subtleties. Or have you asked that question rather than asking directly? Yeah. But the people were really friendly. That was one trip. There was another trip where there was a siege at Paris, a siege in Paris, and they wanted to send a team out there to cover the event. So they've asked the team to go to Heathrow Airport, get onto a private plane to fly to Paris. These were the BBC days. But they asked me to go as an extra person in case it went through the night. I could sort of help out, yes, operating camera or just getting helping the team out. So we got onto the private plane at Heathrow Airport. We were in the air, and we find out as we were nearing Paris that the siege is over. But we still land in Paris. We ended up at a hotel on the Champs-Élysées, and we went out for dinner. And the cameraman was Bernard Hesketh, who went to the Falkland Islands to cover the war. And we went out to dinner, and I still remember having a salmon steak for dinner on the Champs-Élysées. And that what sort of really sold it for me, that this is the life I want.
Yes. It's interesting. Now, when you were going out at that time, you would go with the reporter?
Yes.
So there'd be you, there would be a reporter, there'd be you.
So in those days,
else would there be
so on average, you had a cameraman, soundman, reporter, quite often a lighting man, and if the story requires it, a picture editor, even more equipment. And then you've got possibly a producer.
So you could send the whole thing back as one.
Whole thing as well. So there were more and more people, yes, in terms of compared to now.
Yes. Now, how would you get pictures back in those days?
Usually you had to go to a TV station. You would have a picture editor with you who would then edit the tape to the required 1.5 to 2 minute story. You take that tape, the edited tape, and even the editing, you had to so you're copying one section of a shot from one tape onto another tape. So if it was a 10-second shot or a 5-second shot, you had to copy that across. And if you changed your mind, you have to start all over again.
Yes.
So it was all sequential in terms of each shot one shot at a time. So you then take the edited tape to a TV station, which you had to do a booking, which is usually quite expensive, to feed it onto a satellite dish back into London.
Now,
so this is going. This is
before store and forward.
Before any of the new technology came in.
Right. Okay.
And we can talk about that, the technology shift later on.
Absolutely.
So that was happening. I then applied for so I got the attachment for 2 months, which turned into 3 months, which got extended 4 months. I was still hungry to join news, and I can genuinely say I was hungry. So I had to go back to Birmingham to my old job, but I came to an agreement with the planning people there. So they put me on rota. We had to work rotas on different programs and that sort of. That I would do a chunk of days together. So when I got 3 or 4 days off together, after 2 shifts combined together or something like that, I would then volunteer my services to London. And there were 2 things. One, I'm keeping my hand into the job I was doing in terms of news, going there as a recordist. But the other thing that was happening was sort of the rate I was being paid. So London would pay the mileage as well to get me into London. But they were also paying me at a rate which was as a senior cameraman, which in Birmingham, I was still a junior cameraman. But with the senior cameraman, for me to become a senior cameraman would take another decade or 20 years because of the people stay in the business for a long time, so it was a career path, so it would take a long time to sort of climb the ladder. For me to work as a camera supervisor would have taken me at least another 20 years. Here, the pay scale was completely different because so you had to work on a different system. So that was another incentive to move to London. So I kept on doing that. While I was on my 4-month attachment, a board came up for a job as a recordist. I applied, but obviously there were other people who were waiting in the queue. They got the job. But Ken Oxley, going back to Ken Oxley, I had a chat with him afterwards and he said, to be fair, there are other people in the queue. I can't give you the job, but you'll be an asset to the unit. Those were his words. And to this day, I still mark those words, to be an asset to the unit, because that sort of drove me in terms of that. Right. Yes, it's fair enough. He couldn't give me a job, but he thinks I'm good enough to do the job. And the reason I keep on mentioning Ken Oxley, the sad news is yesterday morning, I got the news that he passed away yesterday morning.
That's very sad.
Very sad, but he was a great influencer in terms of...
a man you owe a lot to.
I owed a lot to in terms of, and sort of subsequently as well.
But in those days, of course, we had personnel officers.
Yes.
And the attachment system was incredibly important, wasn't it?
Yes.
There was a lot of flexibility, which I think has largely disappeared now, probably.
Yes. The attachment system, I asked for a 3-month attachment initially, but they turned it down to 2 months. But going back to personnel officers in the BBC, I was quite naive when I joined the BBC. And about 12 months after I started at Bevan Mill, I bumped into my personnel officer and he said, come up to my office, I need you to sign some papers. And went to his office and I signed some papers to join the BBC pension scheme. I had no idea what a pension was because sort of at that age it wasn't important, and it sort of, in those days people didn't even talk about pensions. Little did I know that my whole life subsequently 40 years down the road is going to change because I signed onto that dotted line. Yes. And I was going to leave the BBC, and that's when the pension thing really came into its effect. Absolutely, so I'm really, I'd love to buy that mine a drink.
Right. Yes. Oh, well, welcome to the Pensioners Association. Yes, quite. That's great.
So I'm still trying to get a job with news. I'm going back and forth. Then a job comes up, and I transferred across in 1984, joined news, as a trainee. As a recordist, not as a trainee, as a recordist. Initially started off doing the miners' strike, working nights in Yorkshire, got being pushed around by the police or the miners.
Yes. Were these the days when you had to fill out hazard assessment forms?
No, there were no...
It was pre-that.
Pre-hazard assessment forms, any risk assessments. Yes. You turn up somewhere, there's something happening, You go there and you find that the event is happening and it might be dangerous. Quite a lot of my colleagues were going to Beirut, and I was jealous because I was not allowed to go. Or some of my colleagues had stories from Vietnam at the time, and I was jealous.
Yes.
And I'm not being gung-ho about it. This is just the news business, how the news business is. So I was quite interested in that sense, in terms of going to events that were happening abroad. And while I was as a recordist, one of the places we got sent to was Djibouti. There were a lot of expats leaving. There were troubles in Yemen, so the expats were leaving. And the Royal Boat Britannia was in the area, was going to pick up some of the refugees, so to speak. And we were sent to Djibouti, and this was cameraman, soundman, me as a recordist, producer, picture editor, and an engineer who could go to the TV station to feed the pictures from the satellite. We landed in Djibouti late at night, went to the hotel which had been telexed to say we're coming, and we're supposed to have our rooms there. And the hotel guy said, sorry, no rooms, because the refugees had come in and taken the rooms. So I went to the Sheraton Hotel, which was the biggest hotel there, to try and go and change some money. And while I was changing the money, the guy behind the counter happened to be of Asian origin, and told him what the problem was. We haven't got a hotel. So the Sheraton was full already. We knew that before we left. This hotel we were supposed to go to, and that even denied receiving our telex. There was no other forms of communication in those days. We either phoned them on the phone or telex. The phones were quite expensive. People tended not to phone, make international calls. The guy behind the counter sort of changed the money, and he sort of explained the story. And he said, give me a few minutes, I'll go and see what I can find. He was trying to be helpful. He went into the back office and then started making calls on our behalf. And he came back a few minutes later and said, I've found a hotel which has got some rooms. If you come with me, I'll take you there. You can have a look and you can decide. So we go to this hotel. It was clean, simple, basic, had beds and ensuite showers. We said, okay, we'll take it on. So we went back to the hotel where the rest of the team was sitting, picked up all the equipment, and it was quite a lot of equipment because the editing equipment on its own, you're talking about at least 100 kilos of baggage. Yeah. Because you had sort of the machines were sort of 30 kilos each, and then you've got the rest of the equipment. This is just the editing. Then you've got the camera equipment as well. Yes. So we had to take 3 or 4 taxis, which will cost an arm and a leg. And this is around 1984, 85, and you're talking about an omelette in Djibouti costing $17, really? Right? So you can imagine how much the taxi was costing. We then got to the hotel about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning with all the baggage, put baggage in a room, and the bar downstairs was still open. And there was a guy who was blind who was singing Stevie Wonder songs, and he looked like Stevie Wonder. I've got photos of him even now. And there were sort of young ladies there serving in the bar. And it took us 3 or 4 days to work out whether the young ladies were despairing. They were really friendly and despairing. Because it was Djibouti, it was a naval base. So the soldiers would come in, and it took us at least 3 days to work out that we were staying in a brothel. But the staff were really friendly. We got what we wanted and what we needed and that sort of thing. We got the story. We went on to one of the warships to cover what was happening in terms of news, people being rescued and that sort of thing. And in the middle of the night, they had to transfer us from one naval ship to another naval ship. And the only way they could do it was through a helicopter. So we had to put a winch on in the dark from one naval ship to another naval ship. So that was a great experience. And that was sort of Djibouti. But I was still interested in cameras, operating cameras rather than being a recordist. So going forward, further down, you was covering Belfast quite regularly. So at the time, I was on attachment on cameras, and I've been covering, there was a child abuse inquiry going on in Middlesbrough. So I was spending a bit of time in Middlesbrough, going up and down the motorway from London. And one day, late morning, we rang London to say there's nothing happening today and tomorrow, so we should come back to London. They said, can you just hang on, because Richard Branson's coming your way somewhere, but we don't know where. Just wait for a while. So we waited for a bit, 1 or 2 hours, and they said, okay, can you go to Hull Airport? There's a helicopter waiting for you. Pick it up we'll see what happens. Richard Branson was doing his first balloon ride from the US, across the Atlantic, from the US to the UK, with her Lindstrad. And there were sort of drama as they were coming in. We drove all the way to Hull from Middlesbrough, got the helicopter. It was a Sikorsky 16, sort of 16-seater helicopter with 3 people on board and 2 pilots. We took off from Hull and we initially flew to Manchester Airport, where the official media team was flown in by Virgin, who were looking after the PR. ITN had the official sort of a contract to look after the media coverage, but the other people had sort of news access. We landed at Manchester Airport and saw this media plane, and while we were waiting for the next move, somebody came up to the helicopter and said, "Have you got any seats?" And I was still not 100% confident in operating. And the sound recorders who I was working with, he said, "No, this is a BBC exclusive. There are no seats." The guy then goes away. He didn't introduce himself, who he was. He comes back a couple of minutes later and says, "I control the airspace around the balloon and you won't get within a mile of it." So the correspondent started panicking, trying to go and talk to him. Because I wasn't involved in that conversation, I stayed back. And he came back and said that he doesn't only want to listen. So that's fair enough. We then take off from Manchester. Initially, we started off heading up north, but then we hear that Richard Branson's balloon is coming across Northern Ireland. And the 2 pilots, who were ex-Navy, very experienced, they suggested we go towards Belfast and see what we find. So we headed towards Belfast, and then they suggested that we should go and get some pictures of it. That's what we decided. So go and get some pictures.
You were filming his balloon as it
So we filmed his balloon in the air from the helicopter, got some pictures, landed at Belfast Airport, creating a scare. This is when the Nolan, this is a helicopter coming in unannounced and that sort of thing.
Course.
But that settled down after a few minutes. Dropped the tape, so at least we got some pictures in the system, and refuel at the same time. We then take off again with a full tank of fuel. And by this time, the balloon had a bit more drama. They had sort of crash landed on land. The balloon had a lot of gas tanks around their cage. They had got rid of those in order to reduce the weight, and they'd taken off again. And we found the balloon in the air, but it was slowly then descending into the water. The ITN helicopter, which was supposed to be the main helicopter, by this time was running out of fuel. And they were quite keen to get us out of the area. And they
Because you were going to scoop them.
Yes, they tried to tell us to move out of the way. And the helicopter pilot said, "We're in the 6 o'clock position. There's no safety issue, and we're staying where we are." So there was no argument. Subsequently, there were 1 or 2 other helicopters there. Because they were running out of fuel, they had to leave in order to refuel. We were there, and we became the marker helicopter for the rescue team coming in, because the balloon then sort of had to crash into the water. Her Lindstrad jumped out of into the water. So I'm getting all this from our helicopter. He was then rescued by a speedboat, her Lindstrad, and taken down. And I got a shot, like if you remember the program Miami Vice, where the speedboat's going down and the helicopter's covering the rescue. And from that, you can see the guy with the silver foil around his body and that sort of thing. So got that shot. Meanwhile, while all this drama is happening, these were the days when mobile phones were just coming in. The sound recorders we had with me was a freelance guy, Alan Smith. He had a brick mobile phone. And at around 6 o'clock, the correspondent was able to do a live phono into the 6 o'clock news of the drama taking place. So that was another scoop from the BBC. So all the rest of the drama happened. Her Lindstrad being rescued. We flew back to Belfast with the tape. That's the point when the battery went down on the phone. We got a taxi, got into BBC Belfast, and got a 1-minute story edited from the rescue, got it on air onto the 9 o'clock news. This is the time when there was a board coming up for a camera job. And I got a phone call that evening saying, "I think the job's been decided." So,
but you'd scooped ITV.
We scooped
They
scooped
hadn't got
ITN.
anything. Yes, yes.
We got a great story, but that was somebody up there looking after me again.
Yes, yes.
And we got the story on the air, and I was after the camera job, and at the age of 27, I was one of the youngest cameramen in the unit as a news cameraman. And that's where the sort of life really changed.
That's where the story really starts.
In those days, I had to work with a sound recordist. And the technology was still changing, but it wasn't changing fast enough. You had to work with a separate recordist. There were two issues. One, there was a new camera coming in subsequently later on, where you had the recorder attached to the camera itself. So the second person didn't have to carry the microphone. The recorder but there were still issues with unions because it was reducing the number of staff coming in, that sort of thing.
But the sound recordist was also responsible for, besides recording the picture coming out of the thing, it was also responsible for positioning microphones.
Recording the audio. So if you do an interview,
it
doesn't matter how many people do an interview, that audio needs to go into the recorder.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going back, one of the stories that happened while I was still a recordist was the Brighton bomb. We used to cover the party conferences. We were in Brighton for the Tory party conference. It wasn't a plum job in those days, sort of going to party conferences. But the Brighton one, because I was junior as a recordist, I was quite happy to sort of whatever came up. So we were covering the event in the day. It was the last day. In the evening, we had some sort of end of political conferences party. We met up in a bar and we had a drink, the camera crews that were there. And we were staying at a B&B fairly close to the conference centre. And middle of the night, there was a big thumping on my door at the B&B. And it was the cameraman, Phil Warren, who I was working with, and he said, a bomb's gone off. So I just had to get ready. And we then went to the back of the Grand Hotel because we've already been told that there were people at the front where there was a bigger damage, but there was nobody at the back. So we went to the back and we saw Margaret Thatcher leaving in a car. Don't know where she went, but I sort of got the shot of that. And then later on we moved to the front, and that's when we realised how big the damage was.
And other people were being carried out.
Other people carried out,
yes.
So all that sort of thing. And then subsequently, one of the cameramen, Bernard Hesketh again, he had a light with a battery, and the rescue people needed a light, so he was allowed to go further in to the control zone to see Norman Tebbit being rescued, and his and other people sort of as well.
Yeah. That must have been extraordinary.
Extraordinary story, and at the time, I thought we needed a cherry picker because where we were standing, we were fairly close to the beach, but there was a sort of break. But they couldn't work anything out in terms of getting the information back to London to say we need a cherry picker to come back in, and that sort of thing. It didn't happen.
Can you rustle a thing like that up at short notice? I mean,
it is feasible, yes.
Yes.
Because it's like hiring it might take 2-3 hours to drive from somewhere, but it would have been possible.
Sure.
They subsequently got it, but the day after, but on the day of the rescue, it would have been more important.
Indeed, yes. Yes, extraordinary being on the spot for that. So that's two scoops you've had.
It wasn't a scoop. There were sort of other teams there.
Well, absolutely, that's true.
But I was there at events which were sort of big events in terms of what's going on. And going back to the sort of Richard Branson thing, then sort of in that year we had the Hungerford shooting. So that was sort of, I was in London at the time, asked to go to Hungerford and spent the night there. But the other thing that happened was while I was still a recordist, sort of going back to before I got the camera job, we were sent to Cyprus for a few days because Terry Waite was going into Beirut to help rescue the hostages.
Yes.
So I thought it was Cyprus, it'd be nice and warm. So took some lightweight clothes, landed there, and we were based at Larnaca Airport, which middle of the night, Larnaca Airport is freezing cold. So initially went in for 3-4 days, and I'd taken just enough clothes for 3-4 days. But Terry Waite went into Beirut, and he was taken hostage himself. So they kept on asking us can you extend it a bit longer? Can you extend it a bit longer? So in the end, I was there for a month. So I had to go shopping for more clothes and more warm clothes.
Right.
But we were working out of Larnaca Airport, staying in a nice hotel. We had to spend a lot of time at the airport itself with other networks. We were the poor guys. At the time, the BBC was attached to NBC, who had a satellite truck based on the tarmac. So if we had to file a story, we would get some pictures, edit them in one of the rooms at the airport, which was done into the sort of media office, and go to the satellite truck and feed it back to London. The reporter there was Keith Graves. He was our Middle East correspondent.
Yeah.
Although the BBC were the poor partner in the NBC relationship in terms of resources, he was the main brain in terms of he understood the Middle East, and he travelled around the area quite a lot. So he was quite respected in that sense. It's sort of his advice in terms of where the story is going.
Yes.
His was the advice.
So Terry Waite had been captured. So basically that was the story.
That was the story, and we were there for a month, but it took him a few years before he came back home.
That was good. Now, you hadn't yet been made up to being a cameraman.
No, after the Richard Branson balloon, the board happened for the camera job. I got the camera job, and I started doing stories. But day-to-day running, I lived in Leicester, and I had to drive to London to pick up a recordist before I could start work. I had the camera car with me and the equipment with me.
So the BBC supplied a camera car.
Car.
And you could use that.
I could use that, but sort of it was beneficial to both sides because all their crews were based in London. If I was in Leicester, they had a crew in the Midlands. So if something happened in the Midlands, especially if I was about to start a shift or if something happened in between, they could ask me to, rather than sending somebody from London, they could ask me to do it. So that was quite beneficial to both sides.
Yeah.
Especially if sort of something happens suddenly, because sort of news changes or whatever happens. One of the stories that comes to mind is the M1 plane crash. I was home on a Sunday evening. My brother rang me and said, there's something happened on the M1. Do you know about it? Or he heard it that there's been some sort of crash on the M1, a plane crash possibly. So I rang the news desk straight away, and news editor on the day was Mike Blakey. And he said, Baz, where are you? I said, I'm in Leicester. That's the reason I'm ringing. And he goes, why the hell are you ringing? you should be going. So I said, what's going on? Yes. Yeah, what's going on? And so that's what confirmed it. So he knew that there was a plane crash. They were trying to send somebody from London, but by the time that they would arrive from London, it would have been 2 hours. So I said, okay.
Whereabouts was the crash?
The crash was near Junction 24, just on the edge of the East Midlands Airport. The plane had tried to come in to land, but for some reason missed the runway and hit the bank on the edge of on the side of the motorway. It was a British Midland flight and crashed onto the embankment at the start of the runway. And another 50 yards, it would have cleared it. For some reason, it was too low and hit that. So I rushed out of my home, heading towards the airport. Obviously, traffic was building up Sunday evening in that area, and the only way I could get through was there was a police car with blue flashing lights going through. So I stuck behind that. One of the things I learned while working in Belfast was road skills in terms of being aware of where you are and what you're doing. So in Belfast, you had to be aware, because if you go to a zone where you might end up in a riot situation or in things like that, one of the things you had to do was drive up your skills, was how to get out of the area. And your driving skills had to improve as well. So I saw this police car, so I just stuck behind that. And as it happened, he went to the junction, and I managed to drive, because of that police vehicle, I managed to drive onto the motorway itself, onto the wrong side of the drive, and parked myself onto the hard shoulder. But I still had a camera and a recorder and a tripod, so to carry all that kit out and I couldn't move about, so I had to put everything down on one side of the motorway, on the opposite side of the plane, and started getting the shots. I must have had some sort of phone communication, because the London sent a dispatch rider to pick up the tape from me, and those were the first pictures which went into the system. So I was the first camera crew.
Oh, really?
Purely because I'm coming from Leicester rather than London. So how the pictures of the plane, people being rescued, all that sort of thing. Because I was on the other side of the motorway. I could see the plane, I could see all the pictures and that sort of thing. But because of the amount of equipment I had, I couldn't move across to the other side. I could have walked across because obviously they stopped the traffic.
Yes.
But I couldn't walk around, and I've got to go away walking around because I was there so early. If I had a smaller camera, but we got the pictures. That was the main thing.
Yeah.
But that also drove the idea that I needed a camera which I could work on my own with. So that was one driving point in terms of physical movement. But also the other objective was sort of because I had to drive every time I had to work, I had to meet up with the recorders. So for self-preservation, I wanted a camera where I didn't have to meet up with the recorders.
You were still running on Ikigamis and things
Still running on Ikigamis.
Yes. So what was the technology that was beginning to evolve then?
There was it was another couple of years before the new cameras were coming out.
Now these were camcorders.
There's a camcorders,
yes,
which was basically an Ikigami 79 with a tape recorder, smaller version of a tape recorder attached on the back, taking the same tapes, made the camera slightly heavier and longer, but it could record.
These were still half-inch tapes.
Still half-inch tapes.
Yeah. So bulky, but portable now.
Yes. And you could only record 20 or 30 minutes at the most. But it's sort of, you talk about, you got a heavy tripod, and then you got the camera as well. But you're talking about good 13, 15 kilos for the weight of the camera with the lens and the battery.
Kept you fit.
and plus the spare batteries and that sort of thing.
Yes, of course.
So that was happening, and there were stories evolving. The 1988, the Lockerbie plane crashed, so I spent Christmas at Lockerbie. And by that time I had met a young lady who lived in Leeds, so I was quite keen to work up north. So I was volunteering my services. So I did an attachment to Newsnight, and we went to Bradford to cover a story about a guy who had written a book called Satanic Verses, which was creating uproar in the community. So I went and covered that story. People were we did interviews with people who were sort of really uptight about this book, but they hadn't read the book.
You interviewed Salman Rushdie, did you?
No, we didn't interview Salman Rushdie. We just interviewed
the people who were
reacting to it.
Yeah.
And it went to a place where they sort of burnt the book and all that sort of thing, because other people were saying that it was it's quite bad for the Islamic religion and that sort of the blasphemous and that sort of thing. And covered that story, and it was later on that the story really took off, and Salman Rushdie got the death threats and all that sort of thing from the back of the book. So the story got bigger after we covered it. This is 88, and then Lockerbie happens. Christmas time, we went to spend the Christmas time there.
Were you doing interviews with people, with relatives and
so
on? That must be very difficult.
It was difficult, but that was just part of the job. So psychologically, not an issue. The interesting thing came when we went to cover the midnight mass on Christmas Eve, and we were in the church, and a woman came and sat next to us. The recordist said, "Merry Christmas," just as because it was Christmas, "Merry Christmas." And the woman was quite blunt and said, "There's nothing merry about this Christmas." And then you suddenly realised we're carrying on with our lives. For them, it's completely different. So that was quite an eye-opener in terms of the woman's remark. But then Christmas Day, we were there. And because we'd been working on Christmas and we had a good boss, Christmas Day, the boss had organised that all the staff who were working over Christmas, Chris Kramer, who was head of news, who I got on with quite well, he organised a hamper for all of us in each room. Small hamper in each room.
Wow. Those are the days.
Those were the BBC days.
Absolutely, yes. And also expenses were quite generous in those days, weren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was enough money in the system in those days.
Enough money in the system. Yeah, sure. Were you proud to be in the BBC? Was that something culturally that you thought was...
My father was very proud in terms of that, because I was travelling. Because he's been in the news business all his life, his son was going to these places, right, which he couldn't go to because of his circumstances. So if he went out somewhere, it was great pride for him. So, he's there, or he's gone there, or he's gone there. And he would make a point of doing the thing, it's gone there. And it's only later on in life that I realised how proud he was because it's sort of, I thought he was just transferring the information that it's sort of it was going to work.
Yes.
But he wasn't saying it was going to work. It's going to this country, it's going to that country, it's going to...
Yeah.
So it was a big pride to him.
Sure. And as far as you were concerned, I mean, once you joined television news as a cameraman, you presumably spent relatively little time.
Yeah, there was
on
sort of
BBC premises.
No, on previous premises, if you're waiting sort of on a quiet day, you'd be sitting at television centre. The way the shift worked was 4 days on, 4 days off. So if you're working the 4 days, you come to TV centre, assuming that you're working in London, and wait for the stories to be called out to go and do stories. So it wasn't sort of running around every day. Though quite often there was nothing happening.
How many crews did they have?
They had a few, but there were at least 4 or 5 crews on every day.
Every day?
Every day. Say you were at a television centre, you had to go to do the 1 o'clock news at Downing Street, right? Taking you at least half an hour to get there. Then you got to park up. Then you got to sort of take all your equipment inside and that sort of thing, or arrange the parking. And in those days, we used to be able to park in the Horse Guards Parade because BBC were allowed there, and walk in through the back steps. Then set your equipment up, and you might be hanging around there for 2 or 3 hours. So that's one crew taken off for half a day. So it's sort of, although it sounds very long-winded, but in terms of the crews were needed. During the miners' strike, we were sort of waiting outside the TUC for long hours, or the coal board. I seem to remember Martin Aidney used to sort of do a lot of reports from there, and we used to spend hours and hours there.
Yes, a lot of hanging around.
A lot of hanging around at the side, because if there are talks going on, you don't know when the talks are going to finish, or when somebody else new is going to go in.
But you had no special privileges when it came to parking?
Nope.
You had to do what everybody else had to do?
You had to sort of use your nous, so to speak, in terms of quite often if you are in the area and you chatted up the traffic warden, they might let you off for a while and that sort of thing. But parking is always a big issue, central London. Outside London, people are much more amenable.
Yeah. But if you were on a big story, it was an important story, it was a rush job, say, would you have a car and a driver?
I have had cars and drivers. Charles and Diana went to France for an official visit. And France is sort of even more notorious in terms of parking and that sort of thing. We had a van with a driver to take us around all the locations, and we made use of that. So in between the events, our lunch break was getting French bread and a bottle of cheap champagne. Because we weren't driving. But this is those were the sort of a happy times, so to speak, good times. You've got to take the rough with the smooth.
Were you happier when you were working on your own rather than when you were working with a team of 4 or whatever?
The team of 4 was quite useful in terms of, because you're talking to people all the time. And it depends who you're working with. If you get on with that person, especially if you're, because the people were always paired up. And the people I worked with, when I was paired up with them, it was great life. Because you're spending more time with them than you are with your own partners at home.
Yes.
Which I subsequently, when I left the BBC 40 years later, that's when I realised sort of how important that relationship was, and to carry on as well. But because of my circumstances were changing, in 1988, I did the Lockerbie thing as a 2-man crew. But in 1990, the things were changing, and I went to Russia as they had a 2-man crew as the main crew, and I was the extra crew, handheld camera, sort of camcorder, as a second crew following Princess Anne around the former USSR. So that was sort of travelling with her on the plane, whole BBC team, with Justin Webb, when he was a news correspondent. We travelled around USSR. She had a meeting with Gorbachev, so met him as well. But the unions had still not agreed to what's happening in terms of single camera operations.
Yes. So it was okay if you were there as an auxiliary, as it were.
No, the conversation was still happening.
It's still happening.
So I was keen to carry on with the trials. And the Gulf War was just about, in 1990, the Gulf War was about to start. Mm-hmm. So they sent me to the naval exercises or the military exercises. So I went to Saudi Arabia with the defense correspondent, see the army preparing. I went to Dubai for the naval exercises. I went to Bahrain for the Air Force. This is with David Shukman, who was then the defense correspondent. And on the naval ship, the British Navy was sort of trying to show off, this is what we're going to do, and they had a mock attack onto the ship. So everybody was action stations and running around and all that sort of thing. And we were on the deck. They fired off a 16, I can't remember what the size of the gun was, but quite a long gun, which was with a 6 or 8 foot tube on it. And when they fired, the whole tube flew off. And this is on camera.
Good Lord.
Quite embarrassing.
That was embarrassing. Were you allowed to use it?
I can't remember. We sent the pictures in. I don't know whether they used it or not.
Yes.
I've never found out, in fact.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, because that's interesting when you're embedded.
Yes.
It's different, isn't it? I mean,
you were part of the team. So we had, in the Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but there were more restrictions.
There were no reporting restrictions.
Oh, were there not?
No, there sort of you had to be. There were safety restrictions, what you could do and what you couldn't do. Yes. But you were with the soldiers. Sort of in the Saudi Arabia, we were sort of sleeping in the desert in a tent with the rest of the soldiers. Sort of that was sort of another experience.
Particularly if sandstorms come.
Yeah, but also the other thing you had to be careful about was every morning your boots. You had to make sure that they were sort of, you turned them upside down and rattled them in case scorpions got in overnight. So that was sort of little things you get taught by the military. That was around 1990. And then the Union it came to a head at the start of the Gulf War. The BBC couldn't come to an agreement, and then we had to sort of back off because there was no union agreement to operate the camcorders as a single man operator, because they were trying to come to an agreement with the camera crews. And as it happened, the Gulf War started January 1991. The Gulf War starts. Because I'd been traveling to the region before the war started, I had visas to go into Saudi Arabia, which was quite important. But because the dispute was going on, I couldn't go in. So
because of the dispute here.
Because the single camera operators, because otherwise I'm sort of letting the team down. The issue was just a single person operating.
Yes.
Which subsequently, 91, they came to an agreement and things got sorted. Because I was keen and willing to work I was keen to work because of personal reasons, because I lived in Leicester. Yeah. If I had a camcorder with me, I can go anywhere. So they started asking me more to go to places. And June 89, June 89, I was in Leicester, and I was due to get married later on in the year. So my fiancée, who was from Leeds, had come to Leicester to have lunch and spend a bit of time with me. And we were at lunch, and I got a phone call from London to say there's a student protest going on in Beijing. Would you be able to go tonight? And I had a quick chat with my fiancée, and I said, I agreed that I'll go.
She knew the kind of life she was going to have to live with.
She knew because sort of the previous year I'd been working in the north quite a lot, driving up and sort of the Salman Rushdie thing. Because she was living in Leeds, I was sort of the Salman Rushdie story we covered was in Bradford. The Lockerbie thing was in Scotland, so I drove past Leeds to. She knew what she was getting into. Yeah. And so I went up to Leeds, dropped her off. I went up to London. I'd been advised that I can't take the camera as a full camera. It'd be better for customs if I broke the things apart as sort of small things. Because if you don't have to present any papers, if you had all the other stuff in your baggage, they were sort of letting people through. That if the camera was not seen, so I had it in a duffel bag on my shoulder, with the lens and the camera body and the recorder all sort of in separate bits. But it fitted in a duffel bag, which was on my shoulders. I just looked a normal tourist.
I see. Walked
through customs, and for a few days we covered the student protests, standing out there with them and that sort of thing. Kate Adie was there. John Simpson was there. I was mainly working with Julian O'Halloran for Newsnight for the protest. So things were getting quiet. So some of the TV channels, including ITN, started to leave and go back to Hong Kong. We decided, the BBC decided to keep the teams on. Then things started changing suddenly, that the army was coming in.
So there'd been student protests, and you'd been filming that.
Yeah, which was completely ordinary student protest.
Before the confrontation.
Before the confrontation.
Yeah.
And then the the authorities decided they wanted to clamp down on the students, and they started bringing the army in. So it was a Friday evening. Friday, sort of, we got the inklings, and because it was coming up to the weekend, some of the media teams had left, including ITN. We decided to stay, or the BBC had decided to keep us there, I should say, rather than we deciding. The BBC had decided to keep us there. Sort of things started happening. Steve Selman, who was in charge of the operation there, he wanted a top shot of the main promenade where things were happening.
Yes.
So we found another hotel room and found a place where the balcony where we could oversee all things going on. We had 4 teams in Beijing at the time. Through the day, the people worked, but at night he put one team to bed, so they'd be fresh in the morning. I went to the hotel balcony to see the overshot. The other teams were on the ground, one with Kate Adie and one with John Simpson, to see what's happening. Kate then, when things started really hotting up, Kate came up to the balcony. This went on for all the way through Friday, through Saturday, through Sunday, through Monday, when things got really quietened down. Mm-hmm. But the people rushing in, bullets flying, all that was happening. Oh. I could see the bullets, sort of tracer bullets in the distance, the tanks coming in. So my camera position was the position where, if you remember the shot of the man standing in front of the tank,
yes,
that was from my camera position.
Wow.
Which, for the still photograph, it was still a iconic picture.
Very much.
But that was from the hotel room. That was sort of shot from the hotel room.
From the balcony.
From the balcony.
Yes. So you were in a place where you. It's not exactly you weren't seen, but people presumably weren't.
There was a large crowd. But there was a large. There was security.
Yes.
There was a large crowd on the ground floor.
Yes.
Outside the hotel, and there was a lot of commotion going on for them to notice what was going on the floors above. So,
exactly.
The media teams were sort of...
yes. So you didn't have this confiscated, for example?
No. So that's the reason, purely because they didn't know what was happening, what we were doing initially.
Yes. Well, it's
because
the iconic shot, isn't it? Yeah.
But the more interesting was how we got the pictures back from there. So the producer, Steve Selman, what he used to do was sort of, everybody sends their tapes back to the hotel where we were staying and editing. They would edit the package. So he would get 2 or 3 copies of that edited report. He would then cycle from the hotel to the airport and see if anybody's going to Hong Kong and say, "Can you take this for us, please?" Every report. So that's how we got so people who were flying out, they would take the tape for us.
Anybody you could find?
Yes, who were willing to take the tape across to Hong Kong. They'd be met by one of our team members at Hong Kong.
Yes.
And then fed through satellite to London.
Almost like smuggling drugs.
Yes, but if the tape's open, you can see what's there.
Okay.
It wasn't sort of packaged in any way. It's just a video cassette, a large video cassette. That was it.
But were they supposed to declare them when they went through customs?
They don't need to, because it's sort of just a video cassette. It's sort of, you don't know what's on it. So that's how we got the pictures across. And then when we got to Hong Kong, they were sort of satellited up across to London. Sort of that was a big story. Right. But this was happening, and then I phoned home after 2-3 days. I phoned my fiancée, and obviously it was a big story in the UK, all over the news. And she was crying on the phone, saying, "Are you coming back home for the wedding?" The story finished in Beijing because after the initial onslaught by the military, a lot of locals got killed. Then it was becoming difficult to film. So I had another small camera, so I was moving around with that, a camcorder. And even then it was getting difficult. And then eventually we decided, after about 3 weeks, we were going to leave. The BBC management were quite happy really happy with the coverage. So they announced that we can go back business class, back to London, in sort of economy from Beijing. So I phoned up the manager, Chris Kramer again, who I got on with, and I said, I don't want to come back business class, but I need to jump into India and do some shopping for my wedding. Would you be happy to pay for the hotel there instead. And he said, okay. So I flew into Mumbai, stayed in a nice hotel, landed at night. In the morning, with the advice from the hotel concierge people, went to a tailor, decided on a suit I wanted to have made. They measured me up, decided on the material, did a bit more shopping. Day 3, went for the trials of the suits. And day 4, in the evening, picked up the suits, went to the airport and came back home. This was June 89. In July 89, I got married. Then 1990, went on a tour with Princess Anne. And then 1991, the Gulf War happened. And because of the birth of my daughter, I couldn't go for the first month. But after that, I went to northern Iraq, southern Turkey, where the Kurdish refugees had crossed the border and they were in major refugee camps with major issues with food supply and all that sort of thing. They spent 2-3 weeks there sort of in very difficult conditions, because sort of it was long drives whichever refugee camp you went to, and the refugee camps were just happened. They weren't sort of planned or anything like that, so people were sort of trying to sort out food for themselves. Got pictures of a truck load of bread, literally a truckload of bread coming into an area, being surrounded by all the local people who were trying to grab whatever they could grab, because there was a shortage of food. And we had to then, in the evenings, go and find some place where we could sleep and do our own food. So we managed to get, with those pictures, plus working with Jerry Bowen, of refugees being controlled by the Turkish authorities, we managed to get a 4-minute, 20-second package, which was sent in for breakfast, and it ran as a lead story on all day. Breakfast, 1 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news, and 9 o'clock news. It was that, the pictures were that strong, because especially with the people who were dying and all that sort of thing. So that's sort of a big impact on that in terms of personal. That was the start of the sort of my coverage of people in difficult situations.
Yes.
Later on that year, they had asked somebody to go to Albania, but that person had decided that he wouldn't go on his own, because he was still working as a two-man crew, and he wanted to stay as a two-man crew rather than become a single-person operator. He had already been to Albania once. So I got a call, would you go as a one-man band? And I said, okay, I'll go.
But with a reporter?
With a reporter.
Yes.
But I was doing me as a technical person.
Yeah.
So we went out there. We went to an orphanage, which the correspondent, Bill Hamilton, had found information that was in quite dire straits. The children were living in a building where the glass was missing. In the winter, it was getting to -7. There was no heating. They were having cold showers. The only food they were getting was from a UK-based charity. And it was in a city called Skodra in the south of the country, which was a long drive, 2-3 hour drive from Tirana itself. So we went to the home, got the pictures, came back to Tirana, and then the hotel we were staying in, there was a newspaper reporter with a photographer as well, covering this, see what they could find. We would have dinner with them, but we couldn't tell them what we found, because otherwise we lose our scoop. So we worked at different places that week, came back, showed the pictures on BBC Breakfast, and there was a huge roar in terms of demand for pictures, sort of interest in the story, and wanted to help. So the BBC was sort of BBC weren't running a charity or anything like that. They weren't raising funds. So Andrew Neil, who used to do breakfast things in those days, was also the editor of the Sunday Times. He saw the BBC pictures, so he organised so that Bill Hamilton wrote an article. I helped him. Whenever I go anywhere, I always carry a stills camera, because that was my first love, and I always take my stills. So I took some photos while I was in Albania. They wanted those, so I sent those out to the Sunday Times. They sent a dispatch rider all the way to Leicester to pick up the photographs. And I had a front page photograph in the Sunday Times, which was a big, as a photographer, it's a big big scoop on me, and a front page article about the Albanian coverage. It subsequently went on. We got involved in sort of more trips. So sort of a couple of weeks later, we went out there again to see the first bit of aid arriving after the fundraising by people in the UK, the charities and that sort of thing.
Were the authorities irritated by this coverage?
No, there was no issue in terms of the authorities. We went in because there was sort of the communism was slowly falling apart. It was the hardest country to get out of. It was hard enough to get in. We only got in because Bill Hamilton persevered. Unlike now, where it's the people are all escaping and trying to come back into the UK from Albania at the moment. But it was the hardest place to get out of at the time. On the main road in Tirana, I had to wait a couple of minutes to get a photograph of a car driving by. This is 1991, and things have changed drastically since. But on that second trip where we went in with the aid to this home in Scotra, the night before, before the aid was delivered to the home, we went to the warehouse. And while we were walking around some rough ground outside, I lost my balance. And I had a camera on the tripod. I was walking with the camera on the tripod, and this is sort of 15 kilos, 20 kilos of weight. And I had a choice of either going down with the camera or letting the camera go on its own. So the camera went down on its own, smashed, the lens smashed against the ground into the camera, and the camera was unusable. Here we are in a big story, and I'm without a camera. The translator we were working with knew people at the TV station in Tirana. So we drove all the way back to Tirana, went to the TV station, see if we could borrow a camera. There was nothing they could have, we could borrow. She made a few more phone calls, nothing we could borrow. And then she got in touch with a cameraman who she knew. We went to his house, and as luck would have it, he had just received a new camcorder, second-hand but new in terms of for him. He didn't know how to operate it. So he said, you can have this if I can work with you to get training, how to use the camera. So again, somebody up there looking after me.
Absolutely. Yes.
So we said, okay, come with us. So we took him on as my assistant. We went and covered the story whereby the first aid from the UK being delivered to this home, and got an amazing shot of a child who hadn't worn any shoes for a while, if ever, because some of the aid was sort of clothes and that sort of stuff. Yes. They put a pair of shoes on him, and he kissed his feet because he had shoes on it. So that was 91.
Yeah.
And then things started moving in terms of the Bosnian War was starting up. So I went to cover in Sarajevo for 2-3 weeks. And while we were there, I was working with Jeremy Bowen. They were getting the children out of the city to a safe place. So we filmed 2 or 3 buses full of small children being loaded onto the buses and being driven out of the city.
Can I just ask you something? You say you're working with Jeremy Bowen. How does that... What's the chemistry there between the reporter and the cameraman? How do you frame a story? How do you work a story out? How does it work?
The camera is the first line of editorial. So you're trying to get a shot, the shots, in order to tell the story. So you've got to have some idea in how the pictures are going to join together. If things are happening fast, you've got to work around it in terms of like the Bosnian story. So you go onto the bus, you get a close-up shot of the children. At that time, we weren't concerned about showing faces. Things have changed since. Shots of the bus with a lot of children, shots of the buses leaving.
This would be discussed by you, with you?
No, you would fairly know, sort of from experience. You don't need to discuss it because you've got a fairly good idea in terms of commentary. Commentary is always written later. This is all sort of depending on what pictures have arrived, so to speak, because they might want to use pictures from elsewhere as well if the story sort of happens somewhere else at the same time. And news, virtually always the commentary is written at the end, when you're editing. So this was happening. The bus went, but as it was leaving, a sniper fired some bullets onto the bus, and a couple of children got killed. They were then brought back into Sarajevo. Kurt Schork, a journalist working for Reuters, found out the mother and the grandmother of one of the children who was killed. And so on the day of the funeral, we managed to go with him to see the mother and grandmother, went to the flat, did the interview, and we had a vehicle which was armoured. We drove to the cemetery to cover the funeral, but by the time we got there, there were lots of mortars landing at the cemetery in Sarajevo. So we walked in, and there were bombs landing reasonably close. The burial had already taken place, but some school children came to lay some flowers, so we filmed that. And even then, the mortars were landing. The cemetery was on a slope, so we then decided that it might be better for us to walk up the hill to get out of the other entrance. But as we were walking up, there were mortars landing on that end. So they decided to walk back down the hill to back where our cars were. And as we were walking down, the grandmother got hit by shrapnel from one of the mortars landing nearby. At that point, when the mortars were landing, I still remember going through a thinking process. Should I be standing up or should I be lying down? Because there are mortars landing. I thought if I was going to get hit, it wasn't going to matter whether I'm lying down or standing up. I might as well carry on getting the pictures. So I carried on getting the pictures. It was only later on when I spoke to a military person that I found out that when the mortars blast, they go off in a conical shape. So you're much safer lying down on the ground. But because the grandmother got injured, she was injured enough to create a drama for TV, but she wasn't going to die. The injury was in her arm, so everybody, the journalists who were there, Kevin Connolly, Jeremy Bowen, Kurt Schork, they jumped in to put the bandages on, that sort of thing. So I was there as a cameraman. There was another camera crew there.
So they become part of the story.
They became part of the story in terms of putting the bandages on. There was another camera crew there as well who was sort of filming from another angle, from another network. We got the grandmother being bandaged up, her daughter screaming. The mother's just lost her child, and now her mother is injured. So they then carry her out of the cemetery. I got the pictures of sort of the car, them putting the old lady into the car, driving off. We went to the hospital, found the grandmother, saw her, she was okay.
Made a very powerful story.
Powerful story, not only for TV, but it was front page headlines at home as well, for the newspapers. And I think Kevin Connolly got a gold award from one of the tabloid newspapers the following day. But meanwhile, we were working out of the UN base. While they were editing, I called home. My wife was crying on the phone. I said, "What's happened?" She said, "I got a call from the office. Something has happened." I said, so basically what had happened, somebody in the office, trying to be helpful, had called my home to say an incident has happened and Baz is okay. But instead of calming their nerves down, in case they see the pictures, it wound my wife and my mother up even more. So I had to then sort of, over the phone, sort of calm them down. They said, everything's okay, something has happened, but I'm okay.
How surreal that they can watch what you've been doing on television and you may be affected by that, golly.
So they were sort of, I had to sort of calm them down on that day. So this was sort of about 91. The BBC employed George Gallagher in the early 90s as the first developing world correspondent. I did quite a few stories with him in Africa because I was quite happy to go in if you excuse the phrase, shitholes of Africa. And so I was quite, if they asked me, I'm quite happy to travel. And especially if they were sending from London, because they had a bureau in South Africa, but I was working out of London.
Because he died recently, but he was a very simpatico, wasn't he? He was very good fellow.
Great guy. We lost a good friend. That hit me quite hard this year when he passed away, because we'd worked quite a lot over the years, different parts of the world. We went to Somalia together. We went to Sudan from Kenya, and one of the trips was sort of to South Sudan initially. there was a famine issue, and we landed at a UN airstrip from a UN with the help of the UN plane, who were delivering supplies to the local UN worker who was based literally on the side of the airstrip, and she was based there. And sort of George wanted to see and meet people who weren't able to walk to the airstrip to get their food. If you've got the energy to walk to get your food, you're okay. But what happens if you can't walk there?
Yes.
We asked the local soldiers who were around, hanging around and that sort of thing, how long? And so, well, it's a 1 hour walk to the nearest village. We can go there. And so we both had 1 bottle of water each. We thought 1 hour there, 1 hour back, we'd sort of be okay. It took us nearly 2 hours to walk there. By this time, the heat is increasing. This is because we got there very early in the morning on the flight, but the heat is increasing. We were there for about an hour, 2 hours, filming the villagers who were literally living in mud huts, hardly any clothes, very tall. I've got some photographs of tall Dinka people who hardly any meat on their bodies because they don't have any clothes on, they don't have meat on them, and little babies. So we spoke to them, got some pictures of them, and then we started walking back. And then initially I was carrying my own camera, but then it got harder and harder because the heat was sort of getting to us. And by the time we came back, we were both suffering from heat exhaustion, and we were lucky we didn't suffer badly. We had to lie down for an hour or so just to sort of calm our systems down. We'd run out of water, and sort of slowly then sort of get our energy back in order to sort of have food, water and that sort of thing, just to sort of survive in order to work later on that trip.
Now, this is bringing you into an area where you're going to deal with an awful lot of famine.
Yes.
Very, very backward parts of the world. It must be very difficult emotionally for you, but also physically, because, you've got to eat, you've got to find hotels, you've got to travel around, and yet you're dealing with people who are starving and perhaps dying around you.
I have come to this is because I've had this conversation with George. I'm quite religious, and he's religious. He's a Christian, I'm a Hindu, and he came to Leicester to give a talk because he'd seen all these sort of things, and he was concerned that God was not doing enough to help these kids. And I look at it in terms of the Hindu philosophy, in terms of that sort of things have happened, that's it, you just got to get on with it. So psychologically, I take it as it comes. I go to these places. My job is to get the pictures, and I can help them more by showing the pictures outside. That was proved in Albania, where when we started showing the pictures, over a period of time, we stopped counting after about £10 million worth of aid went into the country. In terms of Africa and those sort of places, I would go to a refugee camp. My job is to get the pictures out. The refugee camp, there is a bit of food there. They're trying to feed the kids. There's nothing I can do to save that child. But if the pictures go out, the more food might come in, which help the rest of the chain. Yes. And so I would film for a bit, and if it gets too heavy, I would then walk back to the car. I would have water there. I would carry biscuits with me. I would have some biscuits in the car, eat them myself, and then go back and carry on filming. Because there's no point in my philosophy is there's no point in going into a situation where you can't come back out with the pictures. No. Okay, it's pointless.
You can't become the story.
You can't become the story. Absolutely. And that is quite important to me, and not becoming the story. And sometimes it gets quite hard, because I remember one story to Ethiopia, much later on, where we went in and filmed children starving in the Gode region of Ethiopia. And this is sort of because of the history of the Ethiopian famine, it became a huge story. But in the evenings, we would then fly back to Addis Ababa, stay in an ultra 5-star hotel, edit the pictures, go to the TV station, feed those pictures back to London. So London's got the story for the day. We would then come back to the hotel. The hotel had an amazing Italian restaurant. We would have a meal there, go to sleep, in the morning get another charter flight, fly into this region, see these kids sort of literally
starving.
on the verge of starving,
yes.
and then go sort of day in, day out. But the contrast of sort of in the day you're sort of saving the starvation, the other end you're sort of working in a environment, in a hotel, which is sort of not only 5-star but ultra 5-star.
But emotionally, did you detach yourself from what you were seeing?
Yes, I completely, and not detaching myself emotionally, but professionally in terms of I had to make decisions in terms of, because of my grounding when I was a kid in Nairobi, where I'd seen these sort of kids before, and because I'd been looted, mugged in the streets by the age of 10, 11, that sort of thing. So my brain didn't go into an overdrive of seeing these kids starving and that sort of thing.
Yes.
They were suffering, yes. My job was to help them, but the only way I could help them was by showing the pictures. And that decision, I think, partly helped that it doesn't rattle in my head.
Do you think you're unusual in that respect? I mean, you've seen what's happened to other cameramen going out.
People have had PTSD. I think my grounding in Nairobi partly helped because I went to the butchers and that sort of thing. Saw what I saw when I was a kid, and I was on skirmish. That sort of helped me later on in life. But I only realised when my kids arrived. Because even now, I take my daughter to a Sainsbury's, and if they see a bit of blood on a piece of chicken which is in a plastic wrapper at Sainsbury's, they get skirmish about that. So that's where the change of sort of growing up, sort of the grounding at a young age was sort of made a huge difference.
Now tell us about actually working in a very poor country where there are people fighting each other. You said earlier on that there wasn't a hazard assessment process in the early days when you were filming.
No,
by this time
there was no training either.
But by this time, the BBC were much more aware of that.
The BBC was aware
yes.
in terms of safety, but the training happened. The only training started happening after the Bosnia incident.
Yes,
because it happened in front of us. The mortars landing, the cameras there.
Yep.
The management suddenly thought that we need to do something in terms of training, and they started talking to the military in terms of running some sort of training courses. So I went on the initial training course with the military and just sort of getting ideas of what we can do.
What sort of things were they teaching you?
In terms of sort of
example. I mean, you said one about lying down rather than standing
that sort
up
of thing. Just sort of
mortar.
what happens when a bullet goes, what it goes through, what happens when a bomb goes off, what happens to a blast, how the blast travels. So hiding behind a wooden table when there are bullets flying, it's completely waste of time.
Yes.
Hiding behind a car door when there are bullets flying, it's complete waste of time. What you've grown up in sort of watching Hollywood movies is completely sort of, you've got to throw that out of the window. You've got to know what a bullet can do through a brick wall after half a dozen bullets. And I've seen blast sort of explosions taking place, what it does to your head. Like in Sarajevo, how do you sleep? Because there are mortars landing through the night as well. When I was there, I thought I was sleeping okay, because we were staying in a flat overlooking the old city. Quite often, at the middle of the night, one of the nights we had a mortar landing in the house next door, and you've got to take it as it comes. You can't sort of say start panicking. The only way to drive from the airport into Sarajevo city was on the main road, which was known as Sniper Alley. And you had to drive at 80 miles an hour so the snipers don't get you. So we used to rush through that, get into the Holiday Inn, where quite often sort of spent time there, which was sort of half blasted anyway. So that sort of thing. Like in Belfast, it's sort of I've stayed at the most bombed hotel in Europe, the Europa. And this is not blasé. This is all sort of experience in terms of the risk assessment.
Yes, sleep at the back on the first floor.
The assessment comes from experience in terms of you work as a team, and everybody has a say in what you do. So if you go the way Martin Bell used to sort of teach and work, was you go from your wherever you're staying to the location where you're going towards. Initially, everybody's got to be happy to move from point A to point B. Then from point B, if you want to go further in, point C, if everybody's happy, then you move in. If at any point, when one person feels unhappy, then the whole team pulls out.
One person can actually decide that, but of course it's difficult for that person because
it is difficult.
He doesn't want to be the one that spoils the story.
It is difficult, yes. But at the same time, it's important that sort of people feel safe enough that they're not pushed into this location.
No, fair enough. Tell me about clothing too, because now you see people with massive, great body armour and things with the press written on the back and so on.
The flak jackets were there.
Yes.
In Sarajevo, so we were wearing those. And you also had a strapped-on bandage. You always put a bandage on the side, so that's sort of in case you need it. It's there.
You're exposed because you have the word press also on your back.
Things have changed from the 90s to now. The exposure wasn't because you were pressed. The exposure was there because you were in a dangerous situation. And if there are mortars landing nearby and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, that things happen.
No, I mean being labelled as press.
No, that's what I'm saying. That wasn't the problem. It has become a problem now.
Right.
That because they see what they see, that's when we're being targeted specifically.
Exactly.
This is what's changed in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And that's because before we weren't the target, but now what's happened
now
is
you are.
Because we've got a press label on it, you become a target because there are so many cameras around, and you don't know they don't know who to trust. In the old days, because there were fewer people travelling with the camera label on, you had reasonable access. Which
also there's less respect for the press, probably.
Yes, we were in Somalia when the Marines moved in, because there was famine there, which George had been covering, and in my view, part of the reason the Americans went in was because of George Alagai's coverage, because he was so strong in terms of showing what was going on, because he kept on repeating, going in and out.
Yes.
I did some of the trips with him. I didn't do all the trips, but he did a lot of the trips, and that's part of what persuaded the Americans to go in. After a few days after the Americans were in the country, and there was a lot of media around, we went to a place called Badera, where after Mogadishu, the Americans were moving into that town, and the place was quite underdeveloped. We camped out at somebody's house, some aid agency's house, because it was empty and we could go in and use it. And we were camping out on their floor. There was nobody there, but there was no water coming in either. We were carrying bottled water. We were allowed half a litre of water to wash in the morning, each person. We were travelling with the Americans, who had their own plane and a satellite dish. We were working with them, the NBC network. When you go to Somalia, when you arrive there, at the airport, you hire a car, but at the same time, you hire a gunman to go with your car. So we hired a car and a driver, and the driver's brother was the gunman. We then moved to Badera. We flew to Badera, but the producer then came with the driver and brought the car up with the Marines. It wasn't safe to drive at the time until the Marines got there. The producer came with the vehicle when the Marines came in. Little did we know that the car had some sort of history in that city. And so the Americans arrived, and we'd been there, because we'd flown in, we were there a couple of days before them. We'd been walking around, moving around, and there was no issue with the camera equipment. Nobody hassled us, nobody questioned us, nobody looked at us. The Americans arrive and they say, first thing they did was to take all the guns from all the gunmen, including our gunmen. So we lost our security. And then they announced, all these people who are around here, nothing to do with us. So they're trying to separate themselves from the media. But what they created was, they're not going to look after us. So within 10 minutes of that announcement, we were driving in the car, 4 of us, me, I had a recordist with me, producer and the correspondent, and the driver, and we got jumped upon by about 50 people with knives and machetes. They weren't after the equipment or us, they were after the vehicle. So while the producer and the correspondent and the driver were trying to understand the situation and arguing, myself and the recorders, we decided the best thing to do is sort of, because the arguments about the car, to take all the equipment out. So we just took it out onto the floor. And the guys were sort of all waving, but they were all after the vehicle. But we had to psychologically assess that the risk was the vehicle, not our equipment. So we let them go. So we managed to borrow somebody's, we managed to call somebody, pick up a car,
Yes.
and equipment and that sort of thing.
Do they ask you to volunteer to do these things, or are you, as it were, directed to do them?
You're not
it's
directed.
part of
They
the
ask you
job.
to say, my philosophy was, if and it still is, if you don't go fishing, you don't catch. Right? That's always been the case. So if they ask me to go somewhere, I usually say yes. And because I say yes, they're more likely to ask me. So it's a catch-22 situation for
Yes.
them. If they ask me to go somewhere, more than likely I'll say yes. I'll give you no. 1989, the Romanian Revolution happened. Christmas 1989. I was near the news desk in London, a television centre, and they asked me to go to Romania, which would have meant being away for Christmas. This is sort of a few months after Tiananmen Square. I automatically said yes. And then I phoned my wife to say, I'm going to Romania and I'll be away for Christmas. And then a few minutes later, I had to phone back my wife to ask her something else. And she was crying on the phone. I don't really celebrate Christmas as Christmas, but to her it was important that this was going to be our first Christmas. And she started crying on the phone, oh, you're going to be away for Christmas? And it's going to be our first Christmas. So I had to rethink my plan. So I went back to the desk and sorry, I can't do it. So they had to send somebody else. And then come Christmas Day, Boxing Day, we're sitting at home watching the news. And I'm seeing what's happening, and she's watching what's happening. I had to tell her, sort of, I kept on saying, sort of, I could have been there, I could have been there, I could have been there.
Yes.
So since then, she sort of realised that sort of was no point in telling me not to go somewhere because sort of she
Take her with you next time.
exactly. In 1993, there was an earthquake in Iran, and I was asked to go to Iran, and I agreed. We flew out there. We were based in Tehran, but the earthquake zone was further up country. And the Iranian authorities decided to take us there one day in a Chinook helicopter. A Chinook helicopter has got two rotors. It's a large helicopter. I think it was about 65 people on the same helicopter. And I did the whole trip standing up next to the sort of side door. We were up in the air, and where the earthquake had taken place was in the mountain region. And as the helicopter was coming down to land on the ground, a few feet up in the air, the second rotor failed, and the helicopter sort of landed onto the ground. We were lucky that because it was sort of fairly close to the ground, it just landed rather than crashed. We then went onto the ground, filmed the disaster. They advised us that they're going to take 2 trips back to Tehran with the people who were on the helicopter rather than overloading it, do sort of half a load each time. So we decided we'll go on the second, for our safety, we'll go on the second trip rather than the first trip, see if the helicopter comes back in the first place. So the helicopter went, dropped off the people, came back to pick us up. We then flew back. And subsequently, 1 or 2 days afterwards, the same helicopter was taking a minister, Iranian minister, to the earthquake zone, crashed and killed everybody. So we were lucky to sort of we will survive.
Yeah.
But on a subsequent visit to Iran, there was another earthquake a few years later in Bam. And I went back in to cover the first anniversary of the Bam earthquake. And we flew to Tehran and then flew on to Bam. Worked in Bam with the camera, moved around, no issues. Came back to Tehran and I was at a big roundabout where there were some buildings in the middle, mountains in the background, and the sun setting in the background behind that. And in Tehran, you've got to be careful with cameras. You've got to have somebody with you from the authorities because otherwise you're not allowed to film it. I knew that.
Yes.
We had somebody with us. But they weren't next to us at the time. And started setting up the camera to try and get this sunset behind this mountain. Little did I know that the buildings in front were some sort of official building for a foreign embassy, which they were reluctant to they were touchy about.
Yeah.
So I put the tripod, as soon as I put the tripod up and the camera on it, there was one person. Within few seconds, second person, we had to stop filming. We got into a heavy discussion. It wasn't an argument. It was a heavy discussion. They were quite polite. We were then taken to a police station. We waited for about 4 or 5 hours, and we had to call the resident BBC correspondent out to try and help us because we weren't getting anywhere with the police. So we were under some sort of arrest. The resident correspondent came through, explained to them that they were here just visiting, nothing political, no other issues. So they let us go, but I had to leave my tape there. They wouldn't give the tape back. So I lost the day's shoot. At least we weren't there was no long-term damage in that sense.
No.
But Iran's quite a difficult place to work in.
I bet, yes. Even worse now, I suspect.
Even worse now, yeah, especially for the BBC. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
But later on in the year, we went to Khartoum with George Alagaya. Because I was going to Khartoum, I knew it was an Islamic country. There's a Hilton hotel. So I rang up the hotel to find out about alcohol. And they said, we got a minibar in the rooms. We got beer, we got stuff. What they didn't emphasize was that the minibar in the room had stuff in it, but the beer, what they were serving, was alcohol-free. Oh. There's no alcohol allowed. And they didn't mention that phrase, that there's no alcohol allowed in the country. So we landed Khartoum airport. They weren't expecting us, the customs people. Quite often these places, the customs people are expecting us. And but we had television equipment. But the customs guy was quite straight. He said, before we go through the equipment, what about your personal baggage? What have you got? And there were 3 of us. And between us, we had half a dozen miniatures and a couple of full bottles. And you're not supposed to bring this. There's 2 things we can do. We can either arrest you, or if one of you comes with me, we can put it down the drain and you can observe. So I said, okay, I'll go with you. And we went to the washroom, and it was really hard to watch this guy open each bottle in turn, put everything down the drain. But that's another experience which you got to find out. You got to know which you're going. The customs, or the local custom, rather than the airport customs, in terms of what you can do.
That dampened your spirits.
Exactly.
Yes.
But it was fascinating. So went to the Hilton Hotel, which was on the River Nile, standing there. So we got the Blue Nile, the hotels on the confluence between the White Nile and the Blue Nile. Fascinating. Yes. But that's another bit of which I wouldn't have seen otherwise if I hadn't gone. But then later on in the year, there was things happening in Burundi, which is next to Rwanda. And basically the issue was there are 2 tribes, major tribes, Hutu and the Tutsis, and there was fighting going on between them. I was told at the last minute that we had received some pictures from there, but they weren't great. So George, I wanted to go in to see for ourselves what was that going on there. So we flew from London to Brussels, and I was on a different flight to George, who was already, he was on an earlier flight. For some reason, I was working or something else, and I just managed to make the flight, which I did. But when I landed at Brussels, there were the staff were waiting for me at the front door, rushed me to the flight which was going to Burundi, to Bujumbura. We got on the plane, landed in Bujumbura, and as I was getting into the hotel, I bumped into another cameraman I'd seen in Africa before, and we had a quick fleeting chat, and he's pointed me in a direction and said, it's in something horrific. So we sorted ourselves out, sorted the equipment out. Normally when you go to these sort of places, when you land at the airport, you hire a taxi or hire a car, or get to the hotel and hire a car and that sort of thing. So we hired a vehicle, and because of my sort of African upbringing, I used to get involved in that quite a lot in terms of bartering, haggling sort of prices and that sort of thing. Used to love it. We drove down the road and we were trying to work out what he might have seen. So we went through some villages. We came to one village which was empty and there was sort of some signs or sort of something had happened. And I then walked around because it was fairly quiet and I could smell something. So I went up to a building which was the best way to describe it is a sort of a shack from a petrol station. That sort of building alone, because the smell led me to that building. And what I saw was sort of dozens of bodies lying there, being burnt. We then followed the story and found, a couple of days later, we found one person who had survived at a Red Cross hospital. And they told us the story. So what had happened was the head teacher at a local college nearby had told there was this incident happening between the two tribes. And he said, come with me, I'll look after you. So he'd taken them to this building. Solid walls, metal window frames and grills, so you can't get out of from the window, and a corrugated roof. And it then set the place alight. 3 or 4 people managed to push through the roof and get out. One of the bodies was still lying just outside where we were, with his insides been eaten by wild dogs or whatever. Another body was sort of lying in a ditch. And this girl, which we managed to find, she had 80% burns on her body, but she managed to tell us the story of what had happened.
On camera?
On camera. So that was her story. This is what had happened to us. So that was a very strong story. So we then finished in Burundi. We drove through the border into Rwanda. And a lot of people had escaped into Rwanda, so the refugees there. Filmed the refugees. And then we got a flight from Kigali back to London. I think we landed on Tuesday morning, either Tuesday morning or Wednesday morning. Went straight from the airport to television centre, showed the editorial people the pictures, and discussed how we cover the story because it was such strong pictures. And there were concerns. So there was a lot of discussion going on all the way through the day. And I knew from experience what pictures you can show and what pictures you can't show. So I had to shoot that way as well. So all this death and that sort of stuff, we showed pictures of the wide shots of the building, of the people the bodies that were lying there, just close up of the hand or feet or anything like that, rather than being too gruesome. Yes, yes. It was thought out in the way it was shot. They edited a piece for the 1 o'clock news with very few details about the picture in terms of the pictures. For the 6 o'clock, slightly more because it'd be a slightly grown-up audience, and the 9 o'clock even more. On the 1 o'clock, it was a lead story. On the 6 o'clock, it was a lead story. And there had been a bus crash with American tourists. So that became the lead story on the 9, but second story. That story went out, and that was it. A few months later, we won the Amnesty International, a couple of awards from Amnesty International for that coverage.
Did you discover what the motivation was for this headmaster to do these terrible things?
No, never found out because I never talked to them. But it was more of why the incident, the incident had happened where the Hutu and Tutsi were trying to kill each other. That was quite important. We even went to a location, that was one of the hardest things, in fact, in Burundi. They went to a clinic run by some nuns. So what was happening, the people, the mothers were carrying their kids on their backs. So their legs were hanging on the front. You know, in Africa, the way they carry the babies on their backs. And the sort of legs were sticking out at the front. And the soldiers, the Burundi soldiers, were involved in killing these women. So they would bayonet them. So the mother was bayoneted. The child would probably get a bayonet gash in their legs, but they would survive. the mothers would die in the field. So somebody going by would see the child crying, but the mother's dead. They would rescue the baby or the child, toddler. They would bring them to this clinic which we went to, run by the nuns, and they had to sort of patch them up. So we stood in a room whereby they were putting stitches on these kids, but they had no anesthetic. Whatever they do is wrong. If they don't stitch the kid up, they're gonna suffer. If they stitch the kids up without anesthetic, they scream like anything. I had kids at home which were sort of similar age. That was hard to watch in terms of what was going on. So after a while, I had to put the camera down, walk away. All three of us, in fact, there was a photographer there as well, me and George. We had kids at home, so we had to walk away, get the screaming out of our heads, and then come back in and carry on filming.
That's how appalling.
But so this incident happened in Burundi. Fast forward April 1994, I'm sitting at home, and I watch the news. We're showing pictures of this plane crash in East Africa, where the Rwandan and the Burundi presidents were killed. This Hutu-Tutsi fight has started again. Second day, third day, we were showing pictures of expats from Rwanda coming into Brussels, of the expats going in there, expats coming out, what was happening at Brussels airport and that sort of thing, whereby here that people are killing each other. I was off shift, so sort of over the weekend I watched the news, but I didn't get involved. On the Tuesday morning, I was back on shift. And in the morning, I did cover some London story. And at lunchtime, I went back into the office and went to the foreign desk and sort of, what are we doing in terms of this things happening? And they're obviously killing themselves. The editor on the day, she sort of said, would you go in? I said, yeah. So she went in and spoke to the head of news, Richard Sambrook. She said, yeah, go, now. So I just literally, I had always carried a suitcase with me anyway. I just phoned home and saying I'm going. And so I got the overnight flight. British Airways had a flight to Nairobi every night. We had a Nairobi bureau. So I was going to work with Roger Hearing from the Nairobi bureau. So I flew into Nairobi, went to the hotel, had a shower. And by that time, he was organizing, trying to fly into... I found a military plane which was flying to Bujumbura, the country next door. We couldn't go into Kigali itself because there were no flat planes going in. Some military plane was going in, and we managed to hitch a ride on that. So we got to Bujumbura airport with our equipment, got outside, hired a taxi, just told him we want to go to the Rwandan border. Got to the border and told the taxi driver we want to go in. The taxi driver said, I'm not going in. And he said, okay, can we borrow your car to go in? I said, no problem. He said, I'll sit here, you take the car and you can drive in. So we bought a visa for $25 each and drove in. Basically what had happened, both presidents had been killed. So one of the story angles I was looking at was that they would have elected a new president. We somehow managed to find out in this place called Gitarama, the government had set up base there out of Kigali because there were things happening in Kigali, so they had to get out of there. And so we found this college where they were based. Now, honestly, can't remember how we got that bit of information. We managed to get this information. Went in there, spoke to the Prime Minister and the Information Minister, did interviews with them and that sort of thing. I kept on asking the question, who's the new president? But they weren't ready to disclose because they hadn't decided themselves, but they weren't willing to tell us that either. We had to sort of decide whether to go back straight away out of Rwanda or stay overnight. So we found a bar nearby and we spent overnight. In the morning, went back to the people and said, what's happening? I was carrying my camping equipment, by the way, as well. So when we went to the bar, I slept in my tent with my camping equipment inside. We went back and asked the same question about the president. We do an interview and that sort of thing. They said, we can't offer you the president, but I'm going into Kigali with the army. Do you want to follow us? And there was a big carrot dangled in front of us. So we drove in behind them. And effectively we had military escort to go into Kigali where everything was going on. And as we were driving into the sort of city, there was a large line of people leaving, and the militia was sort of stopping them. I mean, there was a long queue, and the militia was checking people's ID. On the ID, it says whether you're Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. If you're a Hutu or a Twa, you could go through. If you're a Tutsi, you were told to sit on the side of the road. I managed to get out of my car, film for 2-3 minutes, this checkpoint, because we were in danger as well, because these guys were sort of, they were not the law, they were just the militia, with machetes and that sort of thing. So filmed that for 2-3 minutes, go back into the car, and as we were getting back into the car to drive back further into the city, there was a break in the crowd, and I could see what was happening on the other side for the Tutsi people who were told to sit on the side of the road. And I got pictures of a guy with a machete chopping through those human bodies. And I've slowed that pictures down, and at the end of the line, there's a toddler sitting down. So saw that firsthand, drove into Kigali, and went to different locations. People burnt alive in their homes, went through some buildings where there were bodies lying outside. There were prisoners in pink uniform, prison clothes, in big dumper trucks going around the city, picking up dead bodies as rubbish. So filmed all that. Defense Minister, we did an interview with him. He was going back out of the city. So we tagged along behind him for our safety, otherwise we can't get out because of the militia. And wherever we drove around, we could I would sort of just wave my hand out of the window saying, BBC, BBC, and we were okay. But those guys could quite easily sort of flicked their machete and said, sorry. But we were lucky in that sense, because in those days the media was less, there was less prominence.
Sure.
And BBC was respected more. So we then drove out, go back to Bujumbura, flew via Cameroon back to Nairobi, edited the story, sent it back to London. So by this time it's Sunday when the pictures are in London. Because of the story from Burundi a few months earlier, there were so many complaints because of the strong pictures that the BBC were reluctant to show dead bodies. So I had this argument that how do you cover a massacre without showing dead bodies? And I was quite strong about that. I didn't agree with the output editor on the day. So I rang up the head of news, Richard Sambrook, at home on a Sunday night, and I told him this is the problem. And he said, okay, put it aside. I'll have a look at the package tomorrow, and we can put it out tomorrow. The following day, they looked at it and they decided to send it in the middle of the package, middle of the report, rather than they had a lead story. And I believe that if I had George Alagai with me, it would have been a lead story whenever he went out, because such a strong piece. So it makes a difference in terms of who the correspondent is as well.
Yes.
So that was a big learning curve as well in terms of. Subsequently, kept on going back to Rwanda. I was there for going in and out all the way through June, July, August. But after the first trip, I got back home, and I sleep quite well normally. And I woke up halfway through the night, and I'd been dreaming that I'd come out of some building, and I was guiding my wife out of this building with wide steps onto the main road. But all across the steps, there were bodies lying around. So I knew there was something wrong. Rang up, there's a BBC helpline number. So I rang them up and made an appointment with the counsellor in Leicester. Went to see the counsellor, and we started chatting, and he said, are you going back in? And I said, yes. And he said, if you're going back in, there's no point of me opening you up. So that was the last bit of counselling I had. But since then, I've been acutely aware of my mental state.
Yes.
I talk about it openly because I've had colleagues who have had PTSD, but touch wood, I'm okay. I'm open about it, my emotions and that sort of thing. I don't, things rattle in my head. In fact, this year, George Alagai passed away, and that hit me quite hard.
Yes.
Emotionally. And then a few weeks later, my father passed away. That hit me even harder. So I'm now even more aware in terms of things going on in my head. But I think I'm okay.
Yes.
But I'm talking about it. But I'm aware that it's it's going to take a small trigger, because I know for a fact, because I've spoken to a lot of psychologists, including people who were involved with helping the soldiers who got PTSD after the Falklands War, because they got it out 10 years after the war had finished, when they were sitting at home. So I keep myself busy and try not to get thinking about sort of my past life and that sort of thing.
These are horrendous things to have experienced.
Exactly. But I think, so going back to my life in Nairobi, sitting in front of that guy, opening the goat's brains up, that partly sort of succumbed me in terms of reducing the pressure in the brain, sort of, and I'm also sort of open to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that's.
Thank you for telling us that, because it's very important. You know, as people talking about these kinds of experiences, you take it for granted they're out there reporting, and that's that. But it must affect you quite a bit if you're.
I think I'm okay.
Yeah, you think you're right.
I think I'm
good.
okay.
Good, I hope so.
What's the other one?
We can always give you therapy here.
No, it's all right. Right.
You all right?
That's we're all right. Yes. The other side of the coin.
Yeah.
I get is because of the stuff I was covering. I got the privilege of covering royal events or official visits by ministers and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So over the years, one of the first ones I did was an event while I was still working as a recordist at Downing Street. And luckily I was carrying my stills camera with me. And it was the meeting of the Queen with Margaret Thatcher and half a dozen other prime ministers, previous prime ministers. So
including Macmillan, I think.
Including Macmillan,
yes.
Harold Wilson, Alec Douglas-Hume, Edward Heath, Wilson. So they were all standing in a line with the Queen.
Yes.
So I managed to get a photo of that for my collection. Little did I know that further down the line, I'll be working with the future prime ministers. So I've travelled with different prime ministers to different parts of the world. Yes. I went to Germany with Margaret Thatcher to cover one of the major EU conferences. Mm-hmm. But I had a soft spot for her because in the old days, if there was events happening like a reception or something in Downing Street, we were allowed inside the building when the people were arriving. Mm-hmm. And she would stand there near the entrance, sort of greeting people as they came in. But she would come and have a chat with us. We weren't the sort of the enemy. She had great rapport with the media, with the camera crews. She always had, part of the reason I had a soft spot is because on one of the conferences, and I can't remember whether it was the Brighton one, I was walking backwards, at the end of, when they've done their speech on the big day, they will walk through the crowd.
Yeah, and you walk back.
So I was walking backwards and something happened, I was about to trip. And she reached her hand out to try and sort of help me.
Oh, really?
So that sort of thing, just sort of, but also the conversation in terms of sort of, she'll be holding a drink in her hand, I think usually a whiskey, but she'd come and have a chat because she, out of respect, rather than sort of completely ignoring us. It's sort of, and it only needs a few seconds of sort of, at least a sort of human-to-human contact.
Yes. And
one of my colleagues, Derek Collier, she got on quite well with him. And one of the conferences, she had a dance with him at a party. That's the reason, partly sort of, she was quite respected by the camera crews. But she was quite brutal in terms of the unions as well, because there's a story of the TVAM on the Zeebugra story, where she went after the unions quite heavily, because the guy, one of the TVAM engineer, was getting something like thousands of pounds per hour because of the union agreement, which had sort of gone wrong. But that's another story.
Right, yes, sure.
But over the years, I've traveled with John Major. Went on a flight to India and Bangladesh with him. Halfway on the journey, this was on a 747. The middle area of the plane was without seats. Mm-hmm. And we had a cocktail party on the flight. And thinking back on it, it was quite amazing. People walking around. But these were then sort of, we landed in Bangladesh. John Major made a speech, and he announced that he had something like 25% of the UK GDP chairmen or CEOs with him on that flight. So you can imagine the number of senior people in terms of industry who were there with the Prime Minister.
Yes. Did you find politicians more agreeable to work with than the royal family?
It depends who you're working with. The politicians, some of them, I find they work with you. One prime minister, I won't mention any names, you would do an interview with him, but there was no contact, no eye contact, nothing. It's sort of like you're different levels of people. John Major, sort of you can have a rapport in terms of, I've got photos of him holding a plastic credit card, because we went to a credit card centre in India somewhere. I got pictures of him with a goat, which he was presented in Pakistan, that sort of thing. Depends who you're working with. So quite often they're okay. The royal family work with most of them. I went to India, Pakistan on the royal trip. There are no flights between Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, and New Delhi, the Pakistan capital of India. There are no commercial flights. But because it was a royal flight, we were able to fly from one city to the other. So I had the privilege of that because of the Queen. Met her a couple of times. What happens on a royal trip is, at the end of each royal trip, the media party traveling with them, you have a reception, no cameras, just have a reception whereby they'll come and meet each one for a few seconds. And so that's the reason I had chats with people. Now I went to Nepal with Prince Harry. I went to Bhutan and India with Prince William and Kate. In Nepal with Prince Harry, he went up into the hills, and there were sort of different camera teams following from different sections. And so he came down the hill, Prince Harry, after spending the night there in the hills, and the local people greeted him with garlands. And there was a long queue, about a couple of 100 meters long, and with each individual person, he bowed down and they put a garland on him.
Really?
Yeah. And I got pictures to prove that. So that was amazing. And we were quite close, and sort of that 2-3 feet away from him, got all those pictures. He then played basketball with the local people and sort of colour throwing and all that sort of stuff. And then we'd agreed that while he's walking down the hill back to the helicopter where he was flying off from, we would walk in front of him, and Nick Mitchell, the correspondent, would do a piece to camera, talk to the camera. So I was walking backwards down the hill on a rough ground. Because I was walking backwards, I hit a lump and I sort of tipped over backwards. Prince Harry just said, okay, sort yourselves out. I'll stop. Sort yourselves out and we'll carry on when you're ready. So he, being very professional, I sorted myself out. I wasn't injured or anything, just sort of tripped a bit. Then we carried on walking, did the piece to camera, walked down the hill into the helicopter, and we were travelling the same helicopter. Prince Harry had got onto the helicopter before me. So as I walked up into the helicopter, he apologised to me because one of his team members was supposed to watch my back while we were walking backwards, but they weren't concentrating, and that's the reason he apologised. So that sort of things happen.
Good, yes.
Then a few months later, I was with Prince William and Kate, and after the end of the trip, we were having the reception. And I mentioned this to Prince William about the incident that happened on the hill. And he said, oh, my brother told me about this, but I didn't know you were the cameraman. That's another thing in sort of what you read in the papers and what they said. The brothers do talk. They get on with each other. I had a conversation with Kate about, because we went to a slum area which had been really polished up. And she was really interested in seeing what the place would really be like, because when they were there, it was all clean. The people were out of the place. There was no crowd. There was no dirt. And she was keen to understand what it was like when it was in normal life, because she's not allowed to go and see those sort of things. So we had a conversation about that.
But I mean, you have to, well, let's just say a bit more about that. You have, if you're covering a story, I mean, they know you're there working and that they're the story. But do you have to sort of not talk to them unless you're spoken to?
You can't question them.
You can't.
Normally, when you're covering the royal event, you can't ask any questions. You might ask them to sort of stand somewhere if it helps in terms of arranging things. But on a royal tour, usually things are pre-arranged. So if it's an official tour, say like Prince William and Kate going to Bhutan, all the places they go to, it's all pre-marked. That somebody's been round, what they're going to see, what they're going to do, where the camera positions are going to be. So the cameras are told where they can go. So one camera from the British side, and one camera from the host country side. On both sides, you cover what's there, and then you might move to another location in the same complex. But quite often it's sort of, you have sort of BBC crew, a Sky crew, an ITN crew, so you then get positions where you're...
Do you pool the material?
All the materials pooled.
Yes.
Because it's not worth the hassle of sort of putting everybody there in the new places. So all that material is pooled, so that's okay.
Yeah.
And just at the end, we try and get the best coverage. I cover the Bhutan India trip, and because I was based in the region at the time, I knew how the local minds think. We went to a monastery inside the royal complex in Bhutan. They had arranged for the local cameras, Bhutanese cameras, to be there, but there was no British cameras. When I found out, I sort of argued with the Royal Palace people, sort of we need to put a camera there. This is what I can do. I can move around here, move around there, and the materials for everybody else. I managed to get some video of Prince William and Kate lighting candles in this monastery. I got some photos as well, because I always take pictures, but I couldn't do anything with the photos because that'd be sort of issuing a royal protocol. So the photos are in my library, but I can't do anything with them.
But really?
Because I've got some pictures that I might be able to use them, but I don't know, later on for my own collection. But one of the biggest things I ever had was a relationship in terms of friendship, I would say, is with Sarah Ferguson. When we went to Albania, on subsequent trips, we found an orphanage where... one of the things that happened was when I went to Albania, one of the trips, we found an orphanage where young adults were in such a bad state. There was no food around and that sort of thing, that kids were eating from the floor and they were mentally challenged. And I got pictures of one child sort of picking up food from the ground and eating that, and the place was filthy. And you could see that quite easily.
Yes.
And Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, she saw the pictures. And this is after her famous incident. She runs a charity called Children in Crisis, and she was interested in going out there. So she rang up, managed to get a number for Bill Hamilton, the correspondent, who had been travelling to Albania back and forth. She rang him up at home, and he works for BBC Breakfast, so he sleeps through the day and works through the night sometimes. So she phoned sort of late afternoon. Bill's son had just come back from school. These are the days when the phones were near the front door. So he goes up to the bedroom, to the first floor, and says, "Dad, there's a Duchess of York on the phone." And Bill says, "Stop winding up, sort of, I've got to go to work in a few hours." So he goes away, comes back 2 minutes later and says, "Dad, there's a Duchess of York on the phone." So Bill answers the phone, and it is the Duchess of York.
Yes.
She wants to meet up because she wants to go to Albania. So Bill and the editor of the programme, Bob Wheaton, they have a private meeting with the Duchess. I was in the US covering another story. So I got a call saying she wants to go out there, and these are the dates, and we're going out there. And it's all hush-hush. And the plan is that I'll do the video as well as the stills, so then we don't have to carry anybody else. We'll arrange everything, and sort of nobody needs to know what's happening. So we fly out with her to Tirana. She's placed in a villa in the city centre, a government villa. That's her residence. We stayed at a hotel. And we then drive up to Skodra, one of the homes where I initially do the video of her sort of grabbing kids, lifting them up, all that sort of little things, usual photo call thing. And then I had to put the video camera down because I was doing the photos as well. So I had to ask her to pose for the still photographs. And she found it a bit strange because sort of normally she's used to doing one thing once and that's sort of, this is somebody directing her. And she suddenly developed a headache. And her sort of entourage, she had the lady, Children in Crisis, she was there. And there was a guy who was supposed to be her security person, but he was more a friend of her partner rather than a security person, but he was there for her security. And they were sort of, we were travelling in the same minibus, and we couldn't have a conversation, but sort of, because she developed the headache, sort of we went back. But the headache was developed because sort of they thought we were crossing the line. But I was doing what I was supposed to do.
Yes.
But she works with the team, and she has dinner with the team in the evenings. So we sat down to dinner together, and then we opened up, and I just told her there's a sort of, Bill had mentioned earlier to me, and I was just relaying the same information. And we said that sort of, we're here because you wanted to come out. We didn't call you, you called us. And we got no interest in your private life. It's the kids that matter to us. And we had a bit more conversation, and so I told her sort of, while we were at it, I think you look too glamorous for the location we were at. And she took everything on board. Following morning, she dressed down, and we covered the story. Came back, the pictures went out. And because she had such bad media press coverage before she went out on this trip, she was quite surprised in terms of, we just did the normal coverage in terms of she went to an orphanage and saw the kids and that sort of thing, and she wanted to help out and she wanted to raise funds. So when the pictures went out, she was so surprised with there was nothing positive or negative about her. It was all about the kids, and she was there, that she sent a bunch of flowers to my house and to Bill Hamilton's house, which she didn't need to do. And since then, we started receiving Christmas cards from them. Yes. But she had promised that she's going to do a fundraiser. So she organised a fundraiser, and I think it was the Grosvenor Hotel in Park Lane. And ticket prices were quite high, and they said, these are the dates, come down. We said, sorry, we can't afford it. A couple of days before, got a message saying, you got 2 tickets each, come down. And we went down there. And it was quite a big collection. It was fascinating to see that sort of a fundraiser. There were people there with lots of money. There was alcohol free-flowing on the tables, sort of people trying to advertise their brands, But Rula Lenska was there. She had auctioned some sort of coat, went for a few £100. Yeah. Sarah Ferguson had written a book about Victoria, Queen Victoria. And that was sort of signed copy was auctioned, but she gave me a copy anyway, signed copy, so that was my collection. But one of the most fascinating thing was, Richard Branson was there, somebody there from the Marriott Hotels, and David Hasselhoff, who did Baywatch. Baywatch is a series where people being rescued on the beach and that sort of thing. Good-looking men, good-looking women on the beach. And he sort of said, okay, I'll offer anybody a place. If you're a woman, whoever wins, if you're a woman, you get rescued by a good-looking man, a bit TV part on the Baywatch program. And if you're a man, you get rescued by Babe. Somebody from Marriott Hotel stood up and said, we'll throw in 2 weeks of free accommodation at the LA Marriott. And Richard Branson stood up and said, I'll throw in 2 flights for the trip. People started auctioning, and it went to something like £25,000-30,000. Somebody paid for this package. And that was, for me, it was just fascinating. So that's funds going into the Albanian, to the Albanian kids. But she kept her promise. And the other promise she made was to have a reception for the people, the aid workers who were working in Albania. And she organised an event at her house. So I've been to her house for a few times. Then I did a subsequent trip with her to India, where she went to interview Dalai Lama. That was organised by her team. So we went in with a camera. So to add it a bit more, we went to Calcutta to see Mother Teresa's place and sort of region around there. This is after Mother Teresa's death. And went to Romania with her to do a trip where sort of she was helping another orphanage there. So sort of still keep in touch, but I can sit down and talk to her. That's the thing. But what was interesting was the people who follow her, they're there for their own benefit rather than a friendship to a person who's sort of vulnerable in terms of any information they can get out, and then they can sort of... And she's slightly... Their lifestyles are difficult. Yes. They can't say anything. Whatever they say is wrong. So that was sort of... And that's what I noticed with Kate. Kate doesn't say anything on a trip. No. She keeps quiet completely because anything they say is just going to be taken so much blown apart.
And what about the Queen? You met her?
Met her a couple of times in India, Pakistan. I was sort of we were in the Golden Temple in India, and there was such chaos that I could literally put my hand on her shoulder. I was that close, and I had to be careful in terms of not to sort of make sure other people were out of the way. so I get my shot,
Yes.
and she's not being pushed around. But sort of, she took it as it came.
Yes.
It's fascinating watching her. Just sort of no drama.
No.
Went to a place called Gilgit in Pakistan with the Duke because he wanted to watch some polo, but that was in a sort of on a private plane. So that sort of thing, it's an amazing privilege in terms of access
Yes.
to go into all these places and getting inside these places which you won't normally see or normally get access to. Sort of, I look at it in terms of not a blasé lifestyle, but it's sort of just very, very privileged in terms of how you can get to, because the job got access to. So travel with, travel to Afghanistan with Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
So we initially flew to a military base in the Middle East to change plane on a commercial flight, and we changed flights there. And I walked into the washroom, and there was Gordon Brown changing his trousers. So that sort of thing, funny bits, was sort of but that's.
But when you were in these rather informal situations with someone like the Queen or the Duke, could you then have a conversation? Could you then ask questions?
No.
You couldn't.
No.
No.
There was no sort of conversations in terms of
interesting
because they don't get into that situation in the first place because they don't know.
They know not to do it.
They know not to do it because they sort of we don't know what because for them it's really difficult, and I can see it when I see it. It just sort of just got to say one word and just sort of slip of the tongue, and that's it. Front page headline.
Yes.
Sadly.
Okay, let's get on a bit. Because there's this whole business of your raising money for girls' education. Tell us about that.
My mum came from a very poor background. Her father had issues, and the only solution for him was alcohol in a village environment in India. And she, at a young age, had to help him sort himself out. And one of the things she had to do was start work at an early age. She used to carry goods from one village to another village on her head. My grandfather was a shoemaker, so she used to help him sort of make shoes. But in order to stop his alcohol, she would go wherever he went to buy goods or sell goods. She would go with him. She used to plaster people's walls and floors in a village environment at a young age. She was very bright. She had the understanding of what was going on around her from a young age, and she helped her family sort of grow. If she, in my opinion, if she had an education, she would have been a lawyer or something. Subsequently, she got married to my dad, moved to Kenya. And in Kenya, I had lots of cousins because my father had sisters, and in those days, people had big families. But they used to come to my mum and dad for advice. So when I was a kid, I could watch these sort of youngsters coming in for advice with my mum and dad. And so that was at the back of the mind. And then I went to Africa quite a lot, so all these sort of things. And one of the Rwanda incidents, which I haven't mentioned, I went to, after the Rwanda massacre for 3 months, 1 million refugees walked out of Rwanda into a place called Goma in country next door called Zaire. The refugees were living in very rough conditions, and the sanitation was so poor. There was a cholera outbreak. So there was 6,000, 7,000 people a day were dying from cholera. And we were there with cameras. And I was watching people literally fall in front of us. On one drive with George Alagaya, we went from one sort of group of people and drove past and drove to another group of people 20 miles down the road or something. But what they were doing, if the people died, they would wrap them up in straw mats and put them on the side of the road. There were piles of bodies on the side of the road, and we guesstimated, within 1-2 hour drive, we saw 5,000 dead bodies lying on the side of the road. On one of these trips out of Goma, as I was leaving, it was announced that the Japanese wanted to donate $20 million. And a couple of weeks later, I came back in because I was going in and out constantly. When I came back in, the donation had taken place, and the donation was 50 brand new Toyota Land Cruisers. right, which were going to be used by the UN to move from camp to camp.
Yeah.
But there was no, and they had basically, the Japanese government had bought these cheaply, put them into the country, so it was very useful for the aid workers, but not for the,
people
on the ground.
No.
So the back of my mind, I wanted to do something. In 2001, I was in India covering a story. It's the biggest gathering of humanity in one place. Every 12 years, there's a specific lunar period where they come to this river and they take a dip in this river, where the meeting of two rivers plus historic river which has gone out, and people come in, literally walk all the way there, take a dip in the river and move away. And you're talking about 20 million people in the same location on the same day. Mm-hmm. And I was covering that story, and after a few days we were coming out of there, 26th of January 2001, there was an earthquake in Western India, in a state called Gujarat, where my family descends from. So I transferred on the day to the earthquake zone, and we covered the earthquake. First couple of days we were in the state capital. There was a bit of damage. We covered the story there. And I was working with Matt Fried, who had come in from Singapore. He was the Far East correspondent for the BBC. And then we moved to a place called Bhuj, where there was utter devastation. 25,000 people had died. A lot of buildings flattened and that sort of thing. And I'd covered other disasters in India before, and this was sort of, because it was Gujarat, I live in Leicester, where there's a large Gujarati population. And I was in touch with my old secondary school called Rushie Mead School. People wanted to donate, but they didn't know where to donate. So I had a chat with the head teacher and told him, just collect the money, put it into a separate account from the school, and it's charity money, and we'll sort it out when I get back. So I got back, joined up with my former English teacher, a lady who used to teach me English quite a few years earlier. She was still teaching there. So the head teacher, Steve White, and a couple of other people, we got together. My view was, from experience, that the best thing to do is start a charity, register it in the UK, and then people have got confidence in where the money's going. Mm. So we spent 12 months doing that. Then I went back in, found a village where girls were missing out on education because they would go to the primary school and they would stop. They would send the boys 6 miles down the road into secondary education, mm-hmm. but not the girls. Not the girls, yeah. So we started a school there, and we were humming and hawing when to start. And the primary school head teacher said, just come in, it's beginning of June, start the process now. So over the phone, I had spoken to the Education Commissioner of Gujarat, and she said it takes 6 months to process and all that sort of thing. But this guy said, come in and let's get something rolling now, because this is the start of the new academic year. So beginning of June, I went, end of May, beginning of June, I flew out to India. Initially went to see the Education Commissioner. And when I finally got to her office, the woman who was saying it takes 6 months to process the education, when she realized what I was trying to do, she said, well, as you're here, I can help you. Why don't we start the thing now? Why don't you fill out the application form to start a school? And I'll get my people on the ground to help you as well. Fast track, but also so I had to find, I think it was £250 in cash to put the application in. So I went out, got some cash, came back to the office, filled the forms out with the help of her aides, put the application in, then got an overnight train, 8 hours, to go from the state capital to the region where we were thinking of starting the school. Got there. Following morning, met up with the education officers, local education officers, walked around the village, found a building where we could, community building, where we could start the classroom. I did that, and that was on the Saturday. Found a building, spoke to the village elders that we can start the class there. They were not going to charge me any rent, and we could start the classroom there. Sunday, I got in touch with an estate agent, with a guy who had some land in order to buy the land to build the school on. So Sunday afternoon, went to have a look at the land, and the guy then came into the Wood City to drop me off at the newspaper, where I wanted to put an ad in the paper. As we were going into the newspaper building, the guy turned around and said, instead of selling you the land, if you're doing this good deed, I'll offer you the land free of charge, 2 acres of land. I then went into the newspaper building, put an ad in the paper which appeared advertised for a teacher. So the ad appeared Monday morning for open interviews Monday afternoon at the local hotel. So I took a room in the hotel, did about 20 interviews with teachers. That was Monday evening. Tuesday, made a decision on one teacher. Wednesday morning, we had a gathering at that community hall with with the locals and 7 young girls, and the teacher had chosen. We started the classroom with the 7 girls, with this one teacher, at the opening ceremony, and I flew back, and the school had started. 1 year later, we got some government land. We didn't need to use the guy who was offering us the land. He gave us the land, and we had to then give the land back because we weren't using it. But the government land, we got that, and we built a school. And in 2004, I took a group of 30 people from Leicester, students and teachers from the Rushmead School there, to open the Rushmead School in India.
It's still going?
It's still going, and we're doing really well. The girls are doing really well. The numbers of students have gone down because other schools have opened nearby and the people have gone there. One girl has become a lawyer. One young lady has become a homeopathic doctor. A couple of girls have become nurses. Other girls have done other things. It's a mixture of boys and girls. But we've changed the mindset, and the girls are getting educated properly. And the problem now we've got is that the girls are getting better grades than the boys, and that's going to create problems for the local community because the girls are brighter than the boys. So,
but it looks as if you've started a trend from more secondary schools in that area.
Yes, it it changes mindset completely.
Interesting.
A lot of girls are getting educated.
Pity you can't do it in Afghanistan.
I can't do it in Afghanistan. We used to go to Afghanistan quite a lot. Fascinating, beautiful country.
Yes.
Traveled with on different trips there, but sadly major issues. Spent a lot of time in Iraq as well over the years. I used to go jogging in Baghdad with George Alagaya when the times were safe, but things changed drastically.
That was Reggie Omar too, wasn't there?
I worked with Reggie Omar there as well. We did. We travelled all the way to the north of the country, in Mosul, which was then taken over by the ISIS. And as it happened, when the Iraqi government went back in to get Mosul back, the war with ISIS, I went to cover that war as well. And that was fascinating because that was my first 3G war. The biggest thing about covering a war zone is technology. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, you need communications to send the pictures back. Over the years, initially you had to have a satellite dish to send the pictures back.
You would send it in real time.
Yes. So you play the tape, play on one side, on one part of the world, so to speak.
Record it on the other,
And there's somebody, I'm going to make sure that somebody on the other end has got a tape recorder and go like you did with the VHS machine. You press the record button, and you've got to be on the phone. So over the years, sort of like in Somalia, because we were traveling with the American, they had a satellite dish about 10 meters wide on a plane. So they would offload everything, and then they could do a live show from Somalia. Back in, so they had to have a large Russian cargo plane to carry that kit.
Yes. But if you hadn't got that sort of...
You haven't got that sort of kit, you can't get the pictures back. So on one of the trips, I had no satellite in Zaire. So I had to fly from Zaire to Burundi, hired a plane, flew to Burundi, got to the TV station, and we were sharing the plane with a French TV company, and at the satellite desk there was no phone, so we had to set up a satellite phone outside. So one person was calling the London or Paris on the satellite phone. The other person was making sure that both sides were recording, and we had to sort of talk to each other, running in and out. And that, I think that trip alone probably took 5 years out of my life in terms of stress to making sure the pictures got back. Yes. That was the original thing, satellite dish. Then slowly the technology was coming in whereby you can send data over the phone line as internet was slowly coming in. And the first bit of technology that I used ever was in 2001, after the Gujarat earthquake. We used a device called the Toko machine, whereby you edit your story and put that video file into that machine, and then you connect that Toko machine to a phone line, which then sends data to the specific location slowly.
Yes.
So 1 2-minute news item, it took 9 hours to send.
But you could do it from any phone.
But you could do it from any phone. Then subsequently we started sending stuff out of different technology. So if you had a satellite phone, you would send the data from your laptop to somewhere else, and that would take the store and forward format, different files, and you're talking about 2-3 hours to send a file if the signal was bad. If the signal was good, it would sort of take 1 hour. But I've spent many a time in sort of places like middle of nowhere in Pakistan or Afghanistan, where we are sending the material back. But it's really stressful watching the time go by.
Yes, of course.
Because sometimes if it gets to 1.5 hours and the file fails, so you've got to start all over again.
Start all over again, yeah.
So that has changed now. Now we've got a system in place whereby I can do a story here now and send it to London within 5 minutes. And it'll be in the building in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah. That's staggering, isn't it?
Since basically 2001. This is how things have really advanced. In the old days, the BBC needed to go into a location to cover a story because nobody else was covering it. But now, because of the new technology, especially with the social media, it is quite easy to go live from locations. Earlier this year, you had the French riots. I went to France with this DSLR camera as my main camera and a device called a live view, which is the size of a normal average book, nothing big. The way the system works is it's got half a dozen mobile phone data SIM cards. On this device, the live view unit I was using had 4 SIM cards. So it uses the data for 4 SIM cards, bonds that data together to send a live video feed back to wherever we want to send it to. So I could go into a riot situation with this, effectively the book size box plugged up to my camera, both running on batteries, and I could do live TV from anywhere. And this is how it's advanced in terms of like going back 20, 30 years, Rwanda massacre coverage. I remember one day we were in Kigali, we got some pictures we needed to send to London, but there was no satellite coverage out of Kigali. So the only way we could do it was fly the pictures back to Nairobi, where there was a BBC office as well.
Yes.
So I went to the airport to look if there were any planes there, and I found a plane on the tarmac parked. I then looked around and I found out that the pilot was staying at the hotel we were staying at. So I went back to the hotel, found the pilot, asked him if he could fly back to Nairobi. So I chartered the plane, flew the plane back to Nairobi, and that's how we got the pictures out. So that sort of thing, I was able to hire planes. In Ethiopia, when we were going in and out of Gode, I would phone the airline and say, right, tomorrow morning I want a small plane to go to Gode. I mean, it was literally on the end of the phone. I was that close to running my own airline business, so to speak.
Huge amount of money BBC was shelling out for hiring planes, presumably.
Yes, and getting the story out, because it's not only the pictures of the price of hiring the plane, but us being paid, plus the satellite charges every night when we send the pictures out. But on the same scale, we were way ahead of the story. And this is the other side of the coin, which people don't realize, is that, so when we went in, I went in with Ragi Omar to cover this mini famine in Ethiopia. And we were supposed to go in with Oxfam. Ragi comes out of Somalia, so he speaks a bit of Somali. And we were friends with one of the government ministers stroke official. So we knew how the system worked in terms of taking our equipment into Ethiopia. And we knew there was sort of a mini famine brewing in the Gode region of Ethiopia. And we flew to, so we were talking to Oxfam because they were sort of, the press officer was sort of, we were in contact with them. This was with Ragi. And with Ragi, we'd been to Ethiopia, so we knew how the things were on the ground and that sort of thing. But this trip was special because it was sort of like a mini famine. While we were planning it, Oxfam were trying to take us and Sky News at the same time, which wouldn't have worked for us because Ragi spoke Somali and the Gode region speaks Somali. So we had more information what was going on the ground and that sort of thing. He'd spoken to people on the phone. I tried to explain that to the Oxfam press officer, but he wasn't sort of, he was trying to sort of bamboozle us and get us there at the same time as Sky for his benefit. Because I've been to Ethiopia a few times and I'm dealing with Ethiopian Airlines, I knew people there. So I found out sort of when our flight was, and found out from the airline that we were booked onto a flight and we were booked on the same flight as the Sky News crew. So Ragi and myself made a decision that we'll jump ship 24 hours earlier. So we flew in, and because we knew the system, we had organised our customs clearance beforehand. We landed at Addis airport. Unfortunately, the airline lost some of our baggage. The main thing, they lost my box with the batteries and everything else. We knew we only had a few hours on the ground when we went. So we had, at the airport, we had a small plane and took off. But the pilot wasn't brilliant and the weather wasn't brilliant. And we sort of landed somewhere on a bumpy middle of nowhere, halfway down. And when we tried to take off, the plane couldn't take off. There were issues with the plane. We were, oh God, we're going to get stuck there. Quite stressful. And we were lucky that the plane was intact when we took off again. Landed in Gode, got the pictures, and pictures were very strong. We saw one girl on the verge of dying. And when we went to cover something else, by the time we came back, she died. Went to the funeral, all that sort of thing. But we couldn't stay overnight because for our safety, because the Gode region's not very safe. We flew back, got those pictures into the system, and it became quite a huge story. So we were there for a while covering that story, going in the morning, chartering a plane, going in, getting pictures, coming back out into this 5-star hotel. After sending the pictures back, go and have a dinner in a safe environment, which was a posh dinner.
Really.
So completely surreal going. That was going on. On top of that, they asked us to stay on for a few more days. And I felt guilty that we were staying in a 5-star hotel when all these people were starving, but it was work. We then came back, and a few weeks later, we went back to cover the story and had a conversation with the locals, plus we had arranged an interview with the president, Meles, in Ethiopia. When we went to see the officials, we found out that 168 journos had gone into Ethiopia on the back of us to cover the story because it was a mini famine. When we sat down to do the interview with President Meles, we did the interview, and after the interview, quite often time for a chit-chat. So we were having a chit-chat with him, and he came out with a story which was fascinating. On our original story, the day those pictures went out, he was having a meeting with some EU official. And the EU official came into the meeting, and the president had asked for some aid. And the EU official said, "I've got nothing for you." So they carried on their meeting, talked about other things for a while, and then they had a break in that meeting. When he walked out of the meeting during the break, his people told him that the BBC were showing pictures of kids dying in the Gode region in Ethiopia. So the same official comes back into the same meeting and says, "I've got 1,000 tons of aid for you," just like that, on the back of the BBC pictures. And I'm not taking credit for those pictures. It's just a story we were told, right? It was just fascinating to see the other side of the coin in terms of sort of because of the pictures, it pushed the EU to put some aid in.
Yes.
And the kids, so he said the 100,000 aid going in. And we carried on talking, and they're just sort of fascinating in terms of how things, because of the power of the pictures,
Yes.
people have to make decisions, and sort of there are kids out there.
Yes.
I can genuinely say, and without being blasé, there are kids out there who are alive, who was saved or their lives had changed because of the back of the pictures.
Can I just ask you one thing? You're in a lot of these countries where there's an awful lot of corruption and so on.
Yes.
What about bribes or money you have to pay to get things done, which over and above?
Officially, the BBC does not pay bribes. I do not pay bribes. But you're on the ground. There are places where you have to grease the palms in order to make everybody's life easier. Otherwise, you're wasting time.
And it's the way things are done.
The way things are done.
Yes.
Prime example was when we were in Goma. We were going back and forth to Rwanda because it was just a single crossing. On the Rwandan side, there was no security or anything like that, but on the Zairean side, they were corrupt like hell. $20 was a sort of the documentation visa every time you went through. But one day there was a correspondent, and she wanted to argue with the official because he was looking for other ways of getting more money. And you have to show your cholera stamp on your yellow fever stamp and that sort of thing. My cholera stamp, because it only lasts for 3 months, had gone out. But I said, this is the start date, and sort of got away with that and that sort of thing. You have to cajole with them. And but every time you went through, you had to pay $20. But this correspondent tried to get into an argument. And I had another military guy in the background clicking his gun. So I had to tell her to sort of shut up and back off. And it was a senior correspondent, and I tell her to back off because sort of otherwise we got into a major situation. Because the $20, $50 is, yeah, it's wrong, but it's the only way things are done, and that's the way you've got to do it. Yes. Zaire was a very bad place. I went to Zaire after the refugees had been there for a while. There were rumours that the refugees had walked further down into the country. So we went to Kinshasa. We flew to Kinshasa, and we had to go to a place called Kisangani, where the refugees were supposed to be coming to. In Zaire, everything's $200. Everything's $200. So in order to go somewhere, $200. If you want to film somewhere, $200 for the permit. So we got a permit to film in Kisangani. Went to the airport, bought the flights, go to the airport. We palmed all the hands at the airport as well, everywhere else, apart from the guy who lets us onto the plane. He looks at the piece of paper. At the last possible point, he says, you've got permission to film in Kisangani, but you haven't got permission to go there. And because we hadn't paid him, and by that time it was too late to pay him anything. So we had to go back into town, made a few more payments, but by that time the plane had taken off with our baggage. We had to retrieve our baggage from somewhere through the airlines. All that was sort of stressful. Yes. But we were running out of cash as well because everything happened on cash. So the only way to get cash was I went to a local Indian restaurant, had a conversation with a guy, and we came to an arrangement where he would give us $4,500 in cash, and his associate in London would be paid through a bank transfer from the BBC, the equivalent amount. And that's the only way we could get cash straight away. So that's what we did. We then flew to Kisangani, and we had major issues because everywhere the sort of soldiers were flying. And but the story wasn't happening because they couldn't see any refugees. We took a plane ride, the stories weren't happening. On the last day, we thought we'd get some extra shots before we go back to the airport and fly back. In the distance, I saw some soldiers, and they were coming, obviously, either drunk or on drugs, started coming towards us. So we started packing our bags, and we had permission. We had a guy from the ministry with us in the back. The soldiers came to us, one guy at the back with a gun pointing. The driver was there, I was sitting here, and he wanted money. And I normally carried a jacket with money in my pocket. By the time I got to my hand in there, he started punching me in my face, and he had a grenade in his hand. The problem wasn't the punching, the problem was the grenade was so old that by rattling it, it would have gone off, could have gone off. But I managed to get sort of a few dollars out, and instead of giving it to him, I threw it onto the floor, so these guys all ran towards it. The driver managed to get out of there because they were rushing for the money. By that time, the government guy was sitting in the back. He had already been beaten up. He was bleeding. So we had to go to the government officials office, and we were under sort of effectively house arrest. And they didn't want us to go out because the BBC were attacked. They didn't want us to put the story out, so they made sure we missed the flight. They had to take a statement very slowly. So they took mine, which took over 1 or 2 hours. So when it came to the correspondence statement, he came up with a plan and said, I love your shirt. Is there any way I can get one? He said, yeah, $50, can get you one. So the $50 per shirt, which you can get in the market for about $3, paid for the shirt, but also got us out of there.
Yes.
We had to go back to the hotel. We had to wait for another flight because we didn't know the next flight was. By this time, soldiers were coming to the hotel, and I got quite nervous, and I really thought I got that close to picking up smoking, and I genuinely felt that I wasn't going to go back home alive. So I called the foreign desk in London, and I told them that I'm concerned that I'm not going to come back home alive. But I eventually managed to get out of there after about 2-3 days.
Was that your scariest?
That's one of the scariest, yes.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes, terrifying. You've had a lot of awards in your time, quite rightly, as far as I can hear from what you've been saying. Tell us about them.
I've been quite privileged in the sense that the stories I've covered has gone on to win awards. The first one was the Tiananmen Square, where the whole BBC team got an award because of the way the BBC covered, because the opposition wasn't there. The Albanian coverage got a RTS award as well because of the children's tragedy. The Albanian government gave us an award, which was their highest civilian order, called the Order of Mother Teresa. He's Albanian, so that's the reason we got that. When the Burundi story happened, where we found the youngsters burnt out, that got 2 Amnesty International awards. Then after that, I went to cover the war with Ragi Omar, or the Ethiopian-Eritrean war, and that got the Pre-Bio award. And then in 2017, I left BBC to go to take a bit of time out, and then went freelance. Because I'd done nearly 40 years in the BBC, the Guild of Television Cameramen, which is the professional body for the professional camera crews, men and women, gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award. That was more meaningful in terms
because
of,
it's from your colleagues.
From the colleagues.
Yes.
For the life. So it's all in terms of privilege.
Absolutely. I think you've had a pretty good career. I'm glad it's still going on. I've
had an amazing, absolute amazing life that I've had the opportunity to go to all these places.
Yes. Bhasker, you mentioned the Mother Teresa Award, but I think you met Mother Teresa herself, didn't you? Tell us about how that happened.
Mother Teresa, the Pope was going to visit Albania. And because of that, Mother Teresa was coming to, because she was Catholic, she was going to come to Albania. And because of our Albanian connections, we found out well beforehand, and we got full access to the whole thing. So we covered the Pope's visit, which meant Mother Teresa was involved in that trip as well. And because we were in contact with the president of Albania, he arranged for us to have an interview with her. So we were that's one of the rarest things of meeting Mother Teresa face to face and having an interview with her. Unfortunately, I think somebody else was taking the photos, and the photos weren't very good. But the video, the interview was quite fascinating in terms of talking to her. But I was doing the camera as usual.
Yes.
But I was in the room, and I was part of the team which interviewed Mother Teresa, which was quite amazing.
She was very small, if I remember.
She was very small. It was fascinating. The day I met her, as I mentioned earlier on, that I don't get starstruck.
No.
She was one person I would really bow down to. I was so amazed that in the Hindu tradition, if you want to take blessing from your elders, you touch their feet. And the first thing I wanted to do was touch her feet. And that was this complete straight first reaction, that I wanted to touch her feet,
Yes.
because I was so much in awe. Since then, I met Dalai Lama. I've had the privilege of visiting lots of religious places, but that was one of the biggest moments. Further down the road, she became ill, and I went to Calcutta while she was in hospital to cover the story with Martin Bell. And then a few months later, Princess Diana died in Paris. So I got a call at 4:00 in the morning while I was at home in Leicester that Princess Diana had died. Can you go to Althorpe near Northampton, where her family's from? I switched on the TV, saw the news. So that morning I went to Northampton, the Althorpe house where the Diana Spencer family is based. And I was there, and a few days later we found out that she was going to be buried there.
On the island?
On the island. So on the night before, they wanted one video camera, one stills camera to go inside and film the island. So I was the person who went in for video for everybody else to film the island. As the funeral was sorting itself out, got the news that Mother Teresa had died. This was the day before Diana's funeral. Initially, we thought it was a joke because Diana and Mother Teresa had met each other, and there was quite a lot of publicity around that. Yes. So initially, I thought it was a joke, and they said it's not a joke. As soon as it was confirmed that it was happening, first thing I did was the hotel in Kolkata where we had stayed before, rang them up and booked a room for myself because I knew it was a huge story. So as soon as the Diana funeral finished, we flew out to Kolkata. The BBC sent a big team in, including a satellite dish, and we paid excess baggage for the satellite dish around the mark of £12,000. I remember that. We flew there, covered the funeral. A few years later, I was based in India for 3-4 years, and when she was made a saint, I was again in Calcutta for that day when it was announced that she was made a saint. So it was sort of quite a privilege in that sense.
But you've never met the Pope?
I met the Pope.
Oh, you have met the Pope?
I have met the Pope because he came to Albania, met him there because there wasn't much media there.
Yes.
So running around, shook hands with the Pope. So sort of quite a privilege for a non-Christian.
I shall now shake your hand.
Thank you very much. Sorry to take up so much of your time.
Not at all. That was really good. Thank you very much. And it's full of so much detail. It's a really valuable recording. It's been a pleasure. It really has.